Ladies and gentlemen, February 10th, 2022, I am Matt Bilinsky, and this is that sweet, sweet weekly dose of sanity that you all need, the Prevailing Narrative. On this week's episode, shortly, I'm going to be having a chat with Shawn Stevenson of the Model Health Podcast. He's one of the top wellness and fitness experts in the game, and we have a lot to talk about in terms of public health, looking back on 2 years of a pandemic, and personal health, and really making that distinction between the day-to-day choices that we make in terms of our own fitness, wellness, and health versus those that have kind of been, for better or worse, heaped upon us over the past couple years because of the pandemic. And, we're not here necessarily to indict all public health, but there have been a lot of public health failures. There have been some successes, but I think public health does not have the standing today that it had 2 years ago in terms of trust with the medical industry, the bureaucrats that are making some of these decisions. And Shawn and I are really going to dive into in a retrospective of where, of what went on the last 2 years in terms of public health decisions that may have really caught up on people that they were not expecting. But in the meantime, this week's topics, as much as they want out, they keep dragging me back in on two topics that, yes, we're going to beat to death because they just won't leave the public sphere. One, Joe Rogan and the controversy that I kind of thought was over, but as it turns out is not over, at least not yet. And masking policy. I'm hoping this is the last conversation we're going to have about this. A lot of activity has been going on around releasing of mask mandates, but selectively not releasing those as of the last week. So we're going to get into a little bit more of that in the political calculus. And hopefully, like I said, last time we will ever have to talk about masks. Rogan. So last week I said, that I termed one of my segments the failed cancellation attempt on Rogan. And it looks like I was generally right. Yes, the cancellation attempt failed, but it was not over. They came back for another attempt. They came back for one more shot at Rogan. And what happened this week the first shot at Rogan was attempts to label him a vaccine scientist and COVID denialist because of a couple guests he's had on recently. That one extinguished without much fanfare. But then someone dug up a bunch, essentially a smash cut of old recordings of Rogan saying the N-word. And the video at first glance looks pretty bad. And then you actually, once again, any edited video you have to be suspicious of right off the bat. But then you take a look at all the actual segments and what he actually said. And in all of the instances, he was not using the term. He was describing someone else using the term. Okay. So first off, I don't want to get into this whole linguistic and moral argument around, racial slurs and this word in particular. I have no interest in using the N-word. I have no interest in I don't know why anyone would want to use it. And this whole conversation about, well, why aren't white people allowed to use it? I mean, that's all ridiculous. No, nobody should be using the word. However, it's clearly distinct from describing someone else using the word, because in that case, you're not using the word. You are, in effect, describing that somebody else did use the word, okay? And if you're trying to nail someone on describing somebody else using a slur or a certain terminology, then, what are we trying to do here, right? Because the whole idea is to stomp out hate and prejudice and make the world a more just and equitable and pleasant place. If you're trying to nail someone for describing somebody else using a word, then stop pretending you're about justice and making the world a better place. You're just about punishing people. You're just trying to nail someone on a technicality or find a way to make them look worse and misconstrue their intent and what they're actually doing. And that's what happened here. But the video, because it looks bad and because in this era things just explode, and Spotify is a public company that does have to balance a number of concerns, which I'll describe in a minute or two. This one did, and also because it came on the heels of the other controversy, this one was a little more difficult for Rogan and Spotify to kind of weave their way around. But as always, we're looking at, what's actually happening here. This is not just kind of a surface controversy about some crass comments or some a podcaster with 1,400 episodes who in past episodes had described a racial slur. There's more stuff going on here. So first off, who really is the target here? And in figuring out who the actual target is, I think it's very telling about how the notion of the political compass is all broken. The rubric for identifying who's right wing or left wing, whatever we thought that was from 1992 to, let's call it, the middle of the 2010s, that's all off the board now. Those standards no longer apply. And it's really interesting. One tweet that was going around a lot was someone, trying to paint Joe Rogan as a right winger, even though, the guy outright said he supported Bernie Sanders in the 2020 election. I mean, I have a hard time squaring him being a conservative or a right winger with that point of view. But beyond that, they made a list and they made 2 columns trying to show that Rogan does not kind of weigh both sides and give equal time to both sides, or left wingers or right wingers. And they said it was essentially his list of guests was very heavily weighted towards what they called right wingers. And then they put 2 columns in there. First off, this was only about 135 guests out of, like I said, I think something like 1,400 episodes. And not all of his guests and his interviews are political in nature, but quite a few are, particularly over the last, let's call it 4 or 5 years. So if you're taking 130 some odd sample size out of 1,400, that's clearly not going to tell the story. Aside from that, individuals that they have classified as right-wing: Sam Harris, Bridget Phetasy, Barry Weiss, Russell Brand, Tulsi Gabbard, who once again ran for president, for the Democratic nomination. She ran as a Democrat. This was not 1986. This was 2020. Brett Weinstein, Steven Pinker, Tim Dillon. I mean, Tim Dillon is a comedian, right? And a crass comedian, a crass gay comedian. And this is very telling in that they're really at this point classifying everyone who is a dissident, who kind of spits in the establishment's face, as a right winger, right? And that also speaks to, to Rogan's following. Rogan's following is not exclusively or even predominantly left wing or right wing. His followers are people who think that the establishment narrative is bullshit. Okay. And that's reflected in who his guests are and who his popular guests are. And that what a lot of the chattering classes cannot wrap their mind around is that simply thinking that the establishment is full of shit no longer can paint you kind of neatly into one corner or the other. 40 years ago, calling out the establishment clearly made you a liberal. These days, in a lot of respects, it makes you a conservative because, the media and academia and corporate America is so overwhelmingly liberal. But it does not, just because you're someone who is a dissident, who is a contrarian, who doesn't buy what a lot of the corporate media is spitting and a lot of the new principles and values that are exposed through corporate America, through human resource departments and PR, that doesn't mean you're a right winger. Okay. Matt Taibbi is someone who, and Glenn Greenwald are guys who very much break this mold, right? I mean, Matt Taibbi, all his writings are anti-capitalist and anti-police state. Like, he wrote a book on police brutality. He wrote a book on Wall Street corruption. And yet, because he doesn't buy into bullshit narratives, for instance, about Russia or a lot of, the kind of racial politics of the last 4 years, they now try to call him some kind of traitorous right winger. And this is just ridiculous. And this is what they do with Rogan's following. And so one tweet that I found very interesting was a description. They're not coming after Rogan. They're coming after his followers. So essentially what they're trying to say is anyone who likes Joe Rogan, anyone who listens to him, we are now impeaching you. We are now smearing and labeling you, his followers, essentially because you guys have deviated from the code, from the narrative. You all have to be just lumped in as some kind of static, knuckle-dragging, cliched right-wing MAGA types. And this does not match reality whatsoever. Okay, even beyond that, they try to. A lot of people were even dismissing this as Joe Rogan is just another Howard Stern. Like, Joe Rogan is not a PhD, but go listen to Joe Rogan's chats, including the people he speaks with, many of whom are incredibly intelligent. These are intelligent conversations, and a lot of these critics can't wrap their mind around how conversations or a public commentator can be simultaneously at one point a kind of, meathead MMA former comedian crass guy who's interviewing Tim Dillon and talking shit, but also interviewing PhDs at the next episode. And it scrambles their brains so much, and it is very much telling that all these former standards or all these the way that we categorize things politically or culturally, like, these terms no longer apply, and people really need to come up with new rubrics for describing them. So that's right off the bat. I mean, I think everyone kind of went in the wrong direction right there. And then, in thinking about who he is or who he isn't interviewing, and going back to the part one of his controversy last week about labeling him anti-vax, you would assume that this means that he's simply not interviewing or providing the other side of the argument. And that is just ridiculous, because it completely ignores 3 months ago in October, he had on Sanjay Gupta from CNN. If you haven't noticed, Sanjay Gupta, the medical resident medical expert at CNN, is pretty heavily in favor of the vax. And he went on Joe Rogan and he got to make his case for COVID restrictions, for the vaccine, for the dismissal of some of these other treatments that Joe had been hyping. And you want to know something? Gupta embarrassed himself. Okay. And this is not arguable. Okay. Gupta even admitted, he acknowledged many times over that his arguments were lightly sourced, lightly supported, and that it acknowledged to a number of instances where CNN and other mainstream media had been caught lying and falsely portraying what Rogan had been saying. Okay. Are you guys familiar with Peter Hotez? Peter Hotez is one of the most fiercely pro-vaccine commentators in the public sphere. Rogan had him on March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, so stop pretending that he's not showing both sides of the argument. He's putting on people who, first of all, he's discussing and he's weighing multiple points of view, but he's given everyone a chance to perform on his podcast. And he was a little more critical and he was a little more adversarial with Gupta, but go listen to the Gupta interview. Let me see for yourself whether Gupta earned his credibility in that conversation. I think it's pretty clear that he did not. Okay, so beyond this scrambling of kind of identifiers and just a misinterpretation of who Rogan's guests and audience are. Once again, what is going on here? So it was brought to a lot of people's attention that the smash cut video, while it had been put together originally in 2019, was already the smash cut video of Rogan saying the N-word, even though he was once again repeating what other people had said and not using it himself. It came out through an account called Patriot Takes on Twitter. And so Patriot Takes is very bluntly a political action committee, right? It is a political account and it is there to advocate for left-wing causes and quote unquote exposing the right wing. This is how they promote themselves. Patriot Takes exposing right-wing extremism. Okay, so once again, people need to understand, and this is something that I described a couple weeks ago in terms of fact checkers. Fact checking, something that purports to be neutral. No, it is a business. The people who are quote unquote fact checkers and who are serving this function, they get paid, and thus they're trying to serve bosses and clients that are paying them. And Patriot Takes is no different. Okay, so Patriot Takes is aligned with another group called Midas Touch. That's MEIDAS Touch. And Midas Touch apparently Midas Touch is an outright Democrat super PAC. It's a super PAC associated with the Democratic Party, and by a super PAC, it means they can raise unlimited amounts of money and spend it however they wish. It's run by these three brothers, and you go to these three brothers' Twitter accounts, and okay, they're left-wing trolls. They're right-wing trolls, and they're left-wing trolls. Okay, no side has a monopoly on trolls, and these brothers, they operate a political consultancy and a PAC for political causes. Okay, so what do you think they're trying to do here? They're trying to gin up a controversy to make a supposed political opponent look bad, because even though Joe Rogan did not try to make the left wing his enemy, the left wing has made him their enemy, because they have anointed him, an anti-vax, right-wing knuckle-dragging crazy person. Patriot Takes and the Midas Touch and these brothers, what they're trying to do is essentially give a case study. So these three brothers, they're the Mesalas brothers, Meiselas, and you look at their history and you look at their accounts, and yeah, these are people who do political videos. They're a fucking video agency. Okay, this is what they do. They try to show their effectiveness in political videos, messaging, and social media. So great. Okay, if we can go find some deceptively edited video of Joe Rogan and use it to boost a controversy, great. That's going to give us a bunch of good shine, make Joe look bad, and we're going to get, like I said, more consulting engagements and more money for our super PAC. That's what this was, okay? And a bunch of useful idiots, of course, piled on and indulged this whole thing and the Midas Touch attempt to gin up this controversy as if it was was actually an injustice, right? As if Rogan had actually done something wrong and said these racial slurs and shown himself to be a bad guy, which, as we all know, or anyone who's paying it any attention whatsoever, is simply false, okay? And so the Midas touch, they're using this as part of their portfolio, okay? They didn't make any secret about it. They were exposed by an account called Vocal Distance on Twitter, essentially, exposed that this is where the video had originally been boosted. And so then Dave Portnoy, who I'm going to get to a little bit more in a second, he noticed that this was very reminiscent of a video that had gone out attacking him. And he kind of floated it to his Twitter account, identifying and exposing, that this group, Midas Touch, had released and boosted the Rogan video. Midas Touch goes ahead and contacts Portnoy and says that they want to have a chat with him. And Portnoy does a live stream with the three Midas Touch brothers. And on that, they just give this ridiculous spin that they're just trying to expose injustice, that they're just trying to show that these are all private companies and thus there is no such thing as cancel culture or First Amendment. This is just them trying to hold people accountable for wrongdoing so that people can see what public figures have said, and if they disapprove of what these public figures have said, to punish them or choose not to listen to them or be part of their audience. This, of course, is all ridiculous. We know this was a hatchet chop. This is very clearly a deliberate attempt to use falsified and deceptive evidence that misrepresents what Rogan did in order to harm his career and put more pressure on Spotify to punish him, okay? And anyone who can't see that a mile away is just disturbingly naive. So then we go to what was the reaction from Spotify, because right off the bat, the first round of this controversy in terms of the vax stuff, Daniel Ek, I even gave him credit from Spotify. I said, listen, he stood by the First Amendment. He stood by Rogan. He told, his partners, his shareholders and employees over at Spotify, that we're not going to do anything about this. And I commended him for that. Then round two, and it includes some racial slurs, which, as we once again know, weren't actual racial slurs, but that was what the controversy was about. At this point, Ek he buckles and he gives in and he releases a statement. There are no words I can say to adequately convey how deeply sorry I am for the way that Joe Rogan Experience controversy continues to impact each of you. Not only are some of Joe Rogan's comments incredibly hurtful, I want to make clear that they do not represent the values of this company. I know this situation leaves many of you feeling drained, frustrated, and unheard. All right, this goes back to a point I made last week. What is this, a fucking daycare center? This is how a person speaks to children. He's speaking to employees at one of the biggest media corporations on earth. And it's not easy to get a job at Spotify. Like, you have to have credentials. You have to be highly educated. Like, he's talking to what are supposed to be serious, sophisticated business people, right? And this is how he talks to it. But this is par for the course in these corporate America hatchet job apologies these days. So long story short, he gives his groveling apology through this note to his staff, and he continues, one of the things I'm thinking about is what additional steps we can take to further balance creator expression with user safety. User safety. Okay, this is another ridiculous concept that sprung up recently, that the content that comes out on social media and digital media platforms is an issue of safety, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, no, apparently these days, words are a safety issue. And this whole notion, just thinking about these things through this prism, is ridiculous. But Spotify decided to indulge that this time. It is difficult to have these conversations play out so publicly, blah, blah, blah. Okay. I deeply regret that you are carrying so much of this burden. Like, what burden are the employees at Spotify supposed to be carrying? Okay. So that some of their friends might bother them on this topic, that they might have to defend the company against. I'm sorry, like there are worse things. There are more stressful and more onerous and oppressive things that happen to you during the course of your job. Regardless, Ek goes on, we must also believe in elevating all types of creators, including those from underrepresented communities and a diversity of backgrounds. We've been doing a great deal of work in this area, but I think we can do even more. So I'm committing to an incremental investment of $100 million for the licensing, development, and marketing of music and audio content from historically marginalized groups. Okay, so this was a shakedown, is what it was. That Daniel Ek is essentially throwing $100 million at the problem to pacify whoever he thought was an aggrieved party. And let's just get do people have any notion of the makeup of the music world? The music world does not underrepresent underrepresented parties. It is heavily diverse, okay? You go and listen to the music on Spotify, the artists that are featured by Spotify, it is heavily weighted in front of groups that occupy only a small share of the population of America. You want to know something? That's great. You want to know why they're successful on Spotify, and where the African-American community or the Latino community, why they have strong representation on Spotify? Because they're good at making music, and they should be celebrated for that. So, but the notion that communities that may be underrepresented in other walks of life are underrepresented in the sphere that Spotify operates is fairly ridiculous. This is a very symbolic and fabricated way to kind of apparently snuff out a controversy. Like, what did we actually do here? This just a bunch of money that's going to groups that already were making a lot of money off Spotify. So this bodes very poorly for how corporations respond to these things. A couple Twitter commentators who I thought had some interesting insight on this. Noam Blum. Cancel culture is just becoming corporate sabotage via social engineering. People are being manipulated into taking out business competitors by convincing them that they're doing something righteous. Instead of offering better services, companies offer morally superior ones. Okay, so this is the free market is now instead of companies competing over who's got the better product, companies compete over who's more righteous, who's more virtuous. Okay, they engage in these symbolic showings which really don't have any substantial underpinnings. They don't actually further justice or stamp out injustice or anything of that effect. Zaid Jilani, who I always go back to, one of my favorite commentators, in the 1990s, many entertainment labels took heat for risque material and basically told Congress to buzz off, saying, if you don't like something, don't listen to it. All right, think about those, explicit lyrics stamps on the covers of CDs, right? They stamped the freaking thing. Everyone knew it was BS. It wasn't going to stop anyone from buying a hip hop CD or some other CD or album that featured crass language. But, that was just the bone that they threw to everybody. So he goes on, the firms in charge today are hyper cautious and they happen to have monopolies over expression. This is a bad combo. Having so much communication and content concentrated on so few platforms, all that have such a low risk tolerance and engage in all of this kind of performative moral capitalism, that's a terrible combination, okay? And this is why we have such a clouded and muddied cesspool of an environment these days. But then you think, who is Spotify trying to pacify? Right? Like, who demanded, hey, we need $100 million given to historically marginalized groups that have not really been historically marginalized in the audio and music world, right? And some people suggest that Spotify had to account for the possibility that other artists were going to leave the platform, right? That a big music act would say, you're not punishing Joe Rogan enough. I'm leaving the platform. And from there, because the switching costs, because encountering music on Apple Music versus Spotify is, it has so many similarities. It's not that like Spotify has an offering that's irreplaceable, right? That would start what's called a preference cascade, and artists and customers were just going to bolt from Spotify. Well, if you're looking at this, what artist on Spotify is sitting there and going, something, I really was going to take my music off Spotify and try to convince all my label mates to do it. But you want to know something? This half-assed apology, keeping Joe Rogan on, but then directing $100 million towards groups that already do pretty well in the music industry, that's the only thing keeping me on this platform. I'm not sure I buy that. I don't think that they were trying to, they could. Possibly there were some big artists who just figured, hey, this is a pressure point that I can push, and I want to do something for my community. So great, I'm going to threaten Spotify, and what I want to see from them is money directed towards my community or my interest group. Maybe that's it, but I'm still finding it hard to believe that any artist was actually serious about leaving the platform. So then you think, who else could they be trying to pacify? Well, think about who X message was directed to. It was directed to his staff and employees. And now this is something that happens quite often, okay? And I think the piece that really typifies this and is very revealing about this is one in the New York Times from about a couple years ago. The title is, "The 37-year-olds are afraid of the 23-year-olds who work for them." People got to understand, these young woke employees at these media companies, they don't observe hierarchy. The tail wags the dog. They'll go and rip on their boss. They will start an internal petition. They will try to put pressure on their bosses and get their bosses fired. Okay, there's this whole idea that, these kooky college kids that were doing all this woke stuff on college campuses a couple years ago, once they get to the real world, they're going to have a rude awakening. No, that's not what happened. They got to the real world and they gave a rude awakening to their bosses. They said, hey, we now operate by a new moral code of racial equity, justice, tolerance, inclusion. Well, faux tolerance, faux inclusion, and faux justice and sensitivity. And either if you don't abide by that, and if you don't have this company, this corporation abide by that, we're going to cause trouble for you. And you want to know something? They've been able to implement that. Okay. These companies are deathly afraid of internal mutiny and their employees coming out and trying to start a controversy based on the company portraying the so-called something that conflicts with the younger employees' values. I really think you got to read this New York Times piece. It's really good. And it explains this entire phenomenon, and that, throughout history, generations have always conflicted about values, about the older generation thinking the younger generation was insane. But for the first time, other than maybe a short stint in the 60s, the younger generation is able to throw their weight around. They get to dictate the morality of their bosses and the companies that their bosses run. And that's really what's going on here, okay? That's what's happening at Spotify. Eck has to make sure that he doesn't have an internal mutiny. He has to grovel to his employees. And this is something that we've been seeing a lot of. Just before I launched this podcast, I recorded a couple test episodes, and one of them was about the Dave Chappelle Netflix controversy. And so it happened to fall on the other side of the line because Chappelle is just that impeachable and because Netflix stood by him. But look what happened with Chappelle and Netflix. He came out with a special that poked a lot of fun at the transgender community, and there was employee walkouts. You had employees, you had them picketing, you had them calling you had employees at Netflix calling their boss a bigot, and really putting a lot of pressure up the chain. One of those employees went a little too far and got fired because they leaked data. You do not screw with Netflix's data. Other than that employee, all these other employees who staged walkouts, who spit right in their boss's face and essentially told them, we don't stand by this company's decision, and you guys are morally contemptible for allowing Dave Chappelle, and you're harming our community. Nothing happened to them. They're still working at Netflix. Think about a generation ago. They'd be out on their ass in 15 minutes. They would be fired so quick your head would spin. Ted Sarandos of Netflix, because Chappelle is just, because he's such a big presence, his numbers are incredible, and also because he approaches these topics with a level of sophistication that gives him some plausible deniability. Sarandos stood by Chappelle. He said, thanks, but no thanks. Employees, listen, we are certainly sensitive to your concerns, but Chappelle stays. So Chappelle, by standing firm, and Sarandos by standing firm with him, he headed off that employee attack. That doesn't happen always. I don't know if you guys are familiar with a gentleman named Antonio Garcia Martinez. He was a product manager in advertising, on the ads team at Facebook during its, heavy growth phase. Was a noted executive at Facebook, left the corporate world for a few years and released a pretty popular tell-all from Silicon Valley and Facebook called Chaos Monkeys. Became a pretty well-known and successful author and internet commentator. A little over a year ago, he decided to re-enter the corporate world and was hired by Apple to run their ad operations. This was a big hire. This made all the tech press, okay, because Antonio had become well-known in these circles through his book and this writing. And when Apple hired Antonio, this was big news, and it signaled, hey, Apple wants to take on Facebook in the ad business. Antonio was fired within 10 days. You want to know why? A bunch of spoiled brat employees at Apple started a petition against him regarding some of the content from his book Chaos Monkeys. And Chaos Monkeys, the supposedly misogynist passage was him writing in kind of a thought bubble semi third person in describing, his concerns in going into his first date with the woman who turned out to be his wife. It's completely it's a writing tool. It's a rhetorical tool that he was using. But of course, they distorted the intent of that and how that was written. And they claimed that he was misogynist and that Apple was violating its principles and making its employees feel unsafe by hiring Antonio. And Apple caved to a freaking petition from 200 whiny brat employees and fired Antonio within 10 days. There's now a lawsuit on that case, and we'll see. And Apple's probably going to have to pay up. But it's interesting to see, what's the value of this? Is Apple willing to cough up 7 or 8 figures to a wrongfully terminated executive just to pacify their employees? It seems that Apple is, right? So you're seeing a lot of mixed data points on this, but the underlying observation stays the same. these media companies and these big corporations now, they have to be concerned about the reaction of their employees to company decisions. And this is not, it took these employees at companies up until this recent woke era, you were going to get fired. Okay. You didn't get to start internal petitions and do walkouts. Those were so rare. Okay. Everyone was too concerned about losing their job. These young, like social justice type employees, they don't worry about this stuff. They want to dictate the morals, values, and the activity of their employers. And in a lot of cases, they're able to do so. Now, so how do some other public figures and companies handle this? The company and the individual that are just the absolute masterclass on dealing in this age of cancel culture and faux social justice and woke stuff, okay, are Coinbase and Dave Portnoy. So Coinbase, and this is a couple years ago now, Coinbase, had been noticing that there was a lot of trouble and a lot of difficulty with employees wanting to speak up about, Donald Trump, the American politics, and leading up to the election in 2020, this was becoming an issue for the company. So Brian Armstrong released a memo that was titled "Coinbase is a mission-focused company," and essentially in that he laid out that Coinbase had only one mission: to on-ramp as many people as possible to cryptocurrency. Okay, and that was the company was only going to focus on its business mission, and that anyone that wanted to discuss anything other than the mission could do so on their private time. If you wanted to discuss politics or engage in political activism, you could do that on your personal time, but Coinbase wasn't going to do it. They weren't going to do campaigns. They weren't going to donate. They weren't going to, have internal town halls about politics. They were focused on building out a cryptocurrency exchange, and that was it. And he said if anyone had a problem with that, if any of the employees wanted to be at a job where they were able to engage in political activism or only work for a company that engaged in political activism, then have a lovely day. We have a nice severance package for you and you can leave. And so there was a big hubbub about this. Okay. He was criticized by, he was supported by a lot of people, but also criticized by a lot. Ooh, how dare Coinbase, try to, silence their employees, including those from marginalized groups, yada, 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 yada. So what was the fallout from that? Coinbase lost something like 50 out of like 2,000 employees. It was nothing. And, they got rid of probably the most sanctimonious, aggrieved, like worst energy employees at the company, and they went on their merry way, and Coinbase went back to its mission. That was a masterclass in how to handle this situation and how to handle these issues. Hey, this is what we do as a company, okay? If you want to engage in political activism, if you want to do all this stuff, great. That's for your personal life, okay? You don't get to do that filtered through the company. And Apple, Facebook, Spotify would have been well served to have taken that tack. They would have saved themselves a lot of trouble. Who are some other companies that have shown leadership in this regard? Shopify, Tobias Lutke, I believe is the way to pronounce the last name. So this is a Canadian company, Shopify, e-commerce backend, and a little bit after the Brian Armstrong memo, he released a statement essentially saying, "We're a team, not a family." Okay, essentially saying if you want your work to treat you like a family and be kind of cultivating, your personal interests, your political beliefs, like that's not this. We're here to do work. We are here to build this company, and you are part of a team, not a family. And that really shut down any of this trouble around, employees getting political at Shopify. Even first, and then in regards specifically, then Armstrong kind of continuing on putting together the proper blueprint and set of corporate protocols here, also released a memo regarding free speech in the First Amendment in response to this Rogan Spotify issue. And essentially he said, and Antonio Garcia Martinez, who's now back to being an online commentator because he's in this lawsuit with Apple, he described it, and was very laudatory about Coinbase's perspective on this. Finally, a tech company is doing content moderation sanely. Policy is grounded in rule of law, as government should police speech and commerce, not companies. The First Amendment is the binding moral standard, even if law does not technically apply to private companies. Let's go over that again. The First Amendment is the binding moral standard, even if law does not technically apply to private companies. Okay, because that's what everyone hides behind. They always cop out by, well, it's a private company, they can do whatever they want. Well, okay, if you actually believe in the principles of the First Amendment, that you should be trying to align with those principles, even if you don't have to legally. Okay, it's a cop out, right? That we can deviate from the First Amendment, that we think it's selectively, that we want to apply it selectively. We only want to use the First First Amendment when it serves its purposes. We don't want to have to abide by it. If we can get away with violating it, then we will. No, companies, particularly companies as applies to content moderation, should use the First Amendment as the binding moral standard, okay, regardless of whether the law applies. And then in terms of where does the First Amendment not apply, looking back on the body of law and where case law, because once again, as we all know, the First Amendment and free speech is not absolute. You cannot threaten people. You cannot defame people. There's lots of things that you can get punished for saying. But the standards for punishment and the penalties, we've derived these over decades and centuries through the law, right? And understanding, okay, when can you or can you not invade someone's privacy? What is defamation? What is a criminal threat? Like, these are not things that just came up over the last 10 years. The courts and the legal system and case law has well-grounded principles of what constitutes these violations, as opposed to this whole new content moderation thing that social media and digital media companies are doing, where they're really making it up as they go along and making it up as they respond to controversies. That's all they're doing. They're figuring out their application and their view on free speech and content moderation in response to controversies, which is exactly what Spotify did here. So we need more Brian Armstrong, more Coinbase, more companies taking that approach, and less companies. And listen, I don't want to be too critical of Spotify because they have generally stood by Rogan. They're going to keep his podcast on the platform, but I feel like this is going to be the beginning of the end of Rogan on Spotify, because they're going to be monitoring him. He's going to have to be a little more careful, and not for justifiable reasons. He doesn't want to be walking on eggshells. I think he's probably out of there once this deal is up. But this kind of tepid, lukewarm 50-50 defense, I don't know how much I'm into it. So I think we need more companies should be taking the Coinbase approach than the Spotify, and definitely the Apple approach. They did Antonio dirty, and I hope he gets them. So that is Coinbase is the company that is setting the gold standard for First Amendment, free speech, and how to handle these cancellation controversies, as an individual who is also showing us the blueprint. And that is Dave Portnoy of Barstool. So back in November, once again, these were the issues that were percolating just before I started recording this podcast. There was a hit job from Insider, formerly Business Insider, and after clearly contacting every female who'd ever had any sort of encounter with Portnoy, they released a piece that tried to portray some of his private sexual encounters as not even non-consensual. They didn't even claim that these women had not consented, but they didn't enjoy the experience. They thought that Portnoy had been too rough, and they kind of tried to stir up or gin up some fabricated, claims or implications of sexual assault. Nothing that even came close to justifying a police investigation. No charges were filed, and it was pretty clear, that these even people who read the story were like, okay, wait, can we even really be sure what they're claiming that Portnoy did wrong? These girls all stayed in contact with him, very friendly, and continued sexual relations with him after the incidents in question. And it was a pretty BS pseudo controversy, but it was the type of thing that did get other people back down on this stuff. 2016, 17, 18, this type of story comes out, someone probably loses their job or their career takes a serious hit. But Portnoy went full defiance and full offensive. He said he just was very defiant in calling this out and saying these are all fabricated situations. This was clearly a hit job. You people are immoral. Business Insider is now just some clickbait emporium, which is what they are. I mean, they try to do this shit all the time now. No longer a respectable tech and finance publication. And he brought out all the text messages between him and these girls, and as much documentary and supportive evidence as possible. And while so many people may give a tepid apology, say I can understand why someone might feel hurt, this or that, and they kind of tiptoe around it, Portnoy made no apologies. He went full offensive. I did nothing wrong. You're lying, and you're all scumbags. Fuck you. And you want to know something? It worked. That quote-unquote controversy disappeared in about a week or two. The Penn Gaming stock took a bit of a hit for a couple weeks, and that was about it, and everyone moved on. Okay, so brings us to last week. Insider decides to round two, just like it was round two on Rogan, round two on Portnoy, and they release another story where a couple of the women that he had sexual encounters with claimed that he filmed them without consent, that he had sent them videos of him having sex with other women, and that one of them mentioned that she was very fearful during a sexual encounter with Portnoy. This controversy was even more half-assed, feckless, and ineffective than the first one. Okay, nobody's even talking about it. It barely created any news whatsoever. The only news that it created was when Dave Portnoy went and filed a 65-page complaint suing Business Insider and the writers behind the story for defamation, right? And he's got quite a bit of evidence, text messages, a lot of communications to suggest that not only were these allegations false, but Insider in its research knew they were false and then knowingly and recklessly went after him anyways. And if he can prove that, he's going to have a big win on his hands. Okay, it's very difficult to prove defamation in the American courts, but it's not impossible. And if there's evidence that if it's so clear cut that the side publishing the accusations knew that they were false or had reason to believe that they were false, you can win one of these. Okay, and Portnoy's attorney Andrew Brettler is a pro. I've dealt with Andrew, myself personally and professionally, and he's one of the best in the business. And Brettler does not take on cases that he doesn't think he can win. So will Portnoy win this defamation suit against Insider and the writers? We shall see. But it's one that Insider is going to have to take seriously. But the real lesson here is, regardless of whether Portnoy wins the lawsuit, the attempt to harm him failed miserably. Nothing happened to his business. All his advertisers stayed with the company. All his fans stayed, and it's pretty much the accusations are getting almost no chatter whatsoever through any media channel whatsoever. You got it. That's a win. And so I think this is pretty clear that if you take the Portnoy approach, if you take the Coinbase approach, and to a lesser extent the Netflix Chappelle approach, because Chappelle's a little bit of a different beast, we're starting to rack up a lot of evidence that offense is the best defense, okay? And that simply telling people, no, I will not apologize. I will not indulge your bullshit, okay? And that this is a bad faith attempt to either, one, outright fabricate lies about me, or two, deceptively misrepresent things that I've said or done, and I'm not having it. And that strategy seems to be winning, okay? And those who kind of tiptoe around things and get on the defensive and give these half-hearted apologies that you can tell their hearts are not in and they do not think is justified, and which aren't justified, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. That doesn't always work out so well. This is part of our continued survey and analysis of quote-unquote cancel culture. I hate to use the term cancel culture because it's overdone and it's cliched, but that's the era that we're living in. We're going to continue to see these controversies sprout up around public figures many times in terms of content moderation, things that they've said on a digital or social media platform, and what are the standards? What are the practices? Where can someone get in trouble? What are the proper responses? So I'm trying to take a very academic and clinical look at this of how these things kind of come about and judging the effectiveness and really the fundamentals of the responses here. So a lot on this one. Rogan, Portnoy, Antonio Garcia Martinez, go follow him on Twitter. I'm going to be interviewing him in a couple weeks. He's fantastic, and root for him in his lawsuit against Apple. This will be the continued study here. So I think this is the temperature is going to cool down on Rogan within the next week or so. It's going to be interesting to see how he does or does not address this on his next few shows. But yeah, they probably buckled a little bit on this one. So I don't know. Hey, congratulations to any of the creators that are going to be in the line of fire on Spotify's $100 million. You are getting paid. All right, so much like Joe Rogan is a story that just won't die, the pandemic, masking, and pandemic policy, hey, we got to keep on talking about it. We're close to the end here, but we still got some more to go. However, the Archduke, the Emperor of Public Health himself, Tony Fauci, did announce this week that he believes the full-blown phase of the pandemic, as he puts it, is just about over. So what do we have to look forward to here? And it seems like we should be able to ease off the brakes, return back to normalcy, aside from those of us who haven't taken steps towards that so far. But who knows? I mean, there have been some people throwing out ideas that we're actually entering one of the most painful parts of the pandemic because, much like being stabbed, the knife doesn't always hurt the most going in. It hurts the most when you're removing it. So what does that look like in the context of the pandemic? There's a piece in the New York Times, and a couple more centrist doctors and public health officials wrote it. The end of the pandemic may tear us apart. A doctor on Twitter, Shira Duran, the way she put it was that this op-ed resonated with me. I believe we are heading into the most divisive phase of the pandemic, and the division will not be, in this case, across political party lines. And so why would this be the most divisive phase of the pandemic. It's because we're going to be dealing with the people who still can't let go and haven't let go. And for them to return back to normalcy and reality, that's going to be a painful process. And I don't want to put too much blame on these people, because it's not that there's such bad people underneath it all. It's that the reality that they've been living in is one that they felt very cozy within, and getting back to a more normal reality for them is very painful. And so I do sympathize on that in that regard. However, they're going to try to make it painful on everybody else, right? As they're going to overemphasize all the threats that they see from getting back to normal life, from people stopping, even from the news, from the pandemic not being in the news every day, or even not being mentioned on this podcast going forward. As Duran goes on, rather the divide is now between those who are more or less risk averse and those who are more or less able to frame risk in context, right? So a lot of people over the last couple of years have been able to do some cost benefit analysis, but a lot of people in a pretty significant share of the American population has simply treated this like this was a big Ebola breakout in some movie. And now they're going to be asked to get back into society, and that's going to get super messy. So what are we seeing in terms of political shifts shifts in the political wind right now? So the New York Times acknowledged blue state governors dropping indoor mask mandates. We've got New York, we've got Connecticut, we've got New Jersey, and now California. So California, Gavin Newsom announced on February 7th, as of February 15th, California's indoor mask mandate will end. The state is still asking unvaccinated people to wear masks inside. Of course, Los Angeles County will be the sole county in the state that maintains its mask mandate. And we'll get to Barbara Ferrer, LA County Health Director, in just a moment, and why LA continues to be the outlier on all of this stuff. So you've got the Democratic governors, you've got a cascade down the chain in these blue states. They're all releasing all the pandemic restrictions. And so why does this happen in such a coordinated fashion, right? It's not, the science doesn't look the same in every one of these states, right? So, or at least the science is how they term it and how they judge science. So what's happening? Per that New York Times story, last week, Democratic governors took their concerns to the White House. As members of the National Governors Association, they gathered for a meeting in the East Room. Several asked President Biden to provide clear guidelines for their states to move from the crisis footing of a pandemic to a recognition that the virus was here to stay. Okay, so we see what happens here. Everyone's tired of it. The polls and the polling is shifting against it. Okay, and the politicians understand that people are tired of these restrictions. They understood that Omicron, they were willing to see how Omicron played out, but they suspected that it was going to be mild and quick, and it turned out that prediction was proven out. So when it proved to be mild and quick, and it's on a major downswing across the country, people have had it. They're not going to stand for these restrictions any further. Per some public polling, as of this week, 70% of Americans agreed with the statement that it's time we accept COVID is here to stay and we just need to get on with our lives. Support for vaccine mandates dropped to 43% from 53%. That's a pretty significant shift. Okay, and a couple months back, that was as high as 70%. And I know a lot of us who are skeptical of the mandates are kind of shocked that so many people would be in favor of them, because a mandate is a very permanent thing, right? But look, public opinion is not permanent. Public opinion shifts very quickly. We're already at 43% support for vaccine mandates. What do you think it's going to be in a month, right? When that's in the third, you think any politician is going to be able to maintain a vaccine mandate when that thing's polling in the high 20s, low 30s? And you see that these people in power, they're only responsive to public opinion, right? Or at least it's at some point that's the catalyst for their behavior. So that's what you're seeing with all these Democrats now trying to walk back, now claiming that the science has changed, that the guidance has to change, the laws have to change because the science has changed. So for instance, we've got Dr. Liana Wen. She's been the resident COVID hysteric medical expert, quote unquote, over on CNN. And she has been in her mind, we've been under emergency catastrophic conditions for 2 years now. Let's go back to some of what she said so as recently as September 2021. According to Liana Wen, the unvaccinated should not be allowed to leave their homes. Listen to that. That's insanity. Okay, she wanted unvaccinated. First of all, until about February, March 2021, everyone was unvaccinated. So by Leana Wen's standards and by her desires, everyone would have been locked in their home for all of 2020, right? And into early 2021. So when we did not have a vaccine, for some reason, she did not think that was, a justified or a valid way to handle society. But apparently when there's a vaccine available, the people who are unvaccinated should not leave their house. Now, February 2022, she gives a big interview. Yeah, the guidance has changed now that the science has changed. Okay, well, this is the problem with using science as this catch-all term, right? What does the science mean? No, the science hasn't changed. The understanding of the virus has not changed. What has changed is that case counts have gone down, right? And we saw they've all gone down in concert. Essentially every state saw the same goddamn curve. It went up super fast towards the end of December, early January, and over the last 2 weeks of January, it plummeted, okay? And that was that was the same trajectory that we saw on a couple weeks delay from the UK, that we saw on a couple weeks delay from South Africa. So the science didn't change. It's that the prevalence of the virus changed, and given the exhaustion of the American public with these restrictions and seeing that the Omicron wave went by so quickly, they're no longer having it. But this is the type of gaslighting these people want to foist upon us. They want to pretend that there's some underlying science that has changed here, okay, that there's something different about the virus, about safety levels and everything, and thus that is the only factor that is governing some pretty significant and never before seen societal restrictions. But we all know that's not true. But look at how coordinated this is. We've got Democratic Congressional Representative Shawn Patrick Maloney from New York. Democrats' plan to fight COVID is working. Cases are down and vaccines are widely available. Explain to me how your plan worked when we saw the same exact case curve in all states, regardless of whether they were Republican or Democrat, whether they had restrictions or not restrictions. And then we saw the same exact curve in the UK, South Africa, Denmark, and all these other places that got hit by Omicron. Explain to me how you're tying the causality of the drop in case counts and the contraction of the virus to your policies. He would, of course, not do that. And then mentioning that vaccines are widely available. Vaccines have been widely available since roughly March, April 2021. January and February, it was specifically for the elderly. By the end of April, anyone who wanted the vaccine, who was above the age of 12, could pretty much get it. Okay, so stop pretending that this is a new development. These vaccines have been available for about 9 months now. So he also says, with science as our guide, we're ready to start getting back to normal. Great. So that's their story. They're going to pretend that we were, for the past 2 years, literally until the last week, we were under some unforeseen conditions. That we saw that we can tie the drop in cases and the trajectory of the virus to certain non-pharmaceutical interventions and the existence of vaccines across the board, and they are going to try to memory hold this. It's kind of a similar thing with what the Republicans are doing with January 6th. I can't really blame them for that either. These are things that look bad politically. So the politicians are just going to kind of gaslight us into ignoring what actually transpired here. So a few weeks ago, I had this discussion around whether or not some conservatives were retconning the situation and ignoring that conditions had been different. I think that claim was mostly incorrect. I mean, they generally were. I'd say, I think Ben Shapiro laid down 10 points. I'd say 7 of them he was correct on and 3 of them he was incorrect on. But we see what's going on here in the blue states with more restrictive Democratic governance, and with the commentators like Leana Wen and Shawn Patrick Maloney, that this is going to be one big gaslighting campaign. That, okay, we saw the people are now fully exhausted. They've hit full COVID exhaustion. We need to get back to normal, and the pandemic, and we're gonna do everything we can, and we'd rather move on. So in the infinite wisdom of Mad Men's Don Draper, as he said, if you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to change the conversation. They were COVID hysterics until literally this week, and now they want to pretend that there is some magical change in the quote unquote science, so this can't be pinned on them, as opposed to some other people who skated to where the puck was going to be. They understood where things were headed. They saw the patterns and they saw the trends, and that's what gave them guidance, right? As opposed to trying to make it all up in real time. But I can't say that this is unexpected, but that is what is occurring. And so to loop back here on California and Los Angeles, LA, we are going to be the sole outlier. We're pretty much going to be the only through February we're in March. We're going to pretty much be the only major American county that still is under an indoor mask mandate. And who gets to make these decisions? It is going to be the director of Los Angeles Public Health, Barbara Ferrer. Who the hell is this woman? She's not elected. Nobody elected her. She was appointed by the Board of Supervisors. Okay. She's not even a doctor. Yet this unelected bureaucrat has dominion over 10 million residents. We are the biggest county. We're bigger than most, a ton of countries. We're twice the size of Sweden, right? Los Angeles. And yet an unelected bureaucrat gets to have domain and get to direct people's lives and all businesses and make these decisions with zero accountability whatsoever. And yet they're still maintaining masking in schools. And so this has been a big problem, right? Is that over the past 2 years, so much of our lives has been outsourced, and the decision-making over our lives has been outsourced to unelected bureaucrats, right? At least with politicians, like, hey, they're up for re-election, right? At some point you can vote them out. A lot of them have a stranglehold over their positions, but technically there's some mechanism of accountability. What accountability is there for a director of public health of a county? And this phase is really not reflected well on these bureaucrats whatsoever. Jay Bhattacharya mentioned, he says, Public health has become a laughingstock because it is forgotten that the health of the public extends far beyond just infection control. Right? It's like we've got to get back to an understanding of public health where there's more factors involved in the collective health of a county, city, state, other than just how widespread a virus or an infection is, right? Mental health matters. Okay. Personal fitness matters. Everything else that ties into whether or not we have a healthy society matters, other than just how many people have a virus, which has, in most age cohorts, a 99.9% or a 99.7% survival rate. And we've got to get ourselves out of this type of thinking. And I think I'm not as pessimistic as the people that I mentioned at the beginning of this segment who think we're coming up on the most divisive piece of this pandemic. I think it's going to be somewhat painful pulling out the knife. It's going to be strange. There's going to be a lot of hostility, but I think that most people are still just ready to move on and are sensible people at this point. But we've still got to recover our sense, and we've got to recover our sense to start looking more soberly at what constitutes a healthy society, right? And to certain extent, think about, and I posted this week on Instagram, and not a comparison, but essentially mentioning that the flu season in 2017 and 2018 was a record breaker. 80,000 people died of the flu that year. Okay, and of course, anytime you mention the flu or a comparison to the flu, everyone, oh my God, you think COVID's just the flu. It's like, no, that's not the point that I was making in posting that, okay? We, in 2017, 2018, with this record-breaking flu season, society was operating normally and had to kind of make its assessment of what it considered normalcy and what it considered the amount of harm that we could sustain before we took certain interventions. And society seemed to be okay with understanding that, hey, there's going to be more harm from this infectious disease, but we're not going to shut down society or impact people's lives in ways that are going to have other health consequences. We made that risk trade-off. So like, what are the trade-offs going to look like going forward, right? If there's a bad flu season, or combining the flu with whatever the remnants of COVID are coming up this winter, like, are we going to go back into a bunch of restrictions that are going to impact people's health and personal fitness and mental health going forward? I mean, these are things we're really going to have to look at. And that's some of what I'm going to be discussing with my guest, Shawn Stevenson, in just a few minutes. And he's just been fantastic about understanding the failures of public health, how to take real personal agency and responsibility for your personal health. But we're going to have to, now that these politicians are taking a bit of their foot a bit off the gas pedal, we're going to have to really hold them accountable to maintain some perspective and understanding that now that we're out of this pandemic, okay, the spread of infectious diseases is not the sole variable determining public health. Are public health and politicians creating good conditions for a physically fit citizenry? Are we allowing people to operate normal socially so they don't, sink into depression and isolation? These are things that we're going to have to be really active about, because we can see what happens when we're more passive. We let freaking incompetent mediocrities like Barbara Ferrer boss us around, dictate our lives in ways that have so many more health consequences than just what the results of COVID are. So with that, hopefully we will track it. We will see, hey, is this the most divisive phase of the pandemic? Once again, I think it will be more divisive than people anticipate, but not the most divisive. So up in a minute, my chat with Shawn Stevenson. Thank you, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Matt Bilinsky, and this is The Prevailing Narrative. And this is a big week in American health. The Archduke, the Emperor of American health, Anthony Fauci, did declare on Tuesday that the full-blown pandemic, as he put it, is almost over. So 2 years now, health has been on everybody's mind. But what type of health are we talking about? Because Fauci is a public health official, but a lot of us, particularly young people, hadn't necessarily thought about health within the public health prism prior to the pandemic. And then as a pandemic comes around and an airborne virus, we start having to think about our health in terms of, of institutions, of policies, of restrictions on our life that we had never had to experience before. While we previously had thought about health mostly in terms of our day-to-day personal decisions, diet, fitness, sleep, mental health, what have you. So I think it's really interesting now to kind of look back on that for coming up on 2 years of the biggest public health crisis in American history, at least the last 100 years. And we're going to get into all of that with Shawn Stevenson, who is with me today. He is the creator of the Model Health Show, which has been featured as the #1 fitness and nutrition podcast in Apple Podcasts and iTunes. And while Shawn has been a student of biology and kinesiology, it appears that his real fitness and wellness journey started as a teenager when he was diagnosed with a degenerative bone disease, and he kind of took it upon himself to address that problem and really take agency over his personal health. So Shawn, first off, thank you for joining us, and I'd love to hear a little bit about the beginning of your fitness journey and kind of establishing personal agency and attacking this illness that you had as a child or as a teenager.
Sure, yeah. So growing up, I was an aspiring athlete, and coming from the neighborhood that I grew up in, a large portion of my life, I lived in Ferguson, Missouri, which has become kind of infamous or famous at this point. And so I lived in what's considered to be today a food desert. So I lived in Ferguson for a nice chunk of my life, and also East St. Louis, South St. Louis. So these kind of inner city areas where the environment's a little bit dangerous. Mm-hmm. You got to be careful going to the school, to the bus stop. But like I said, most importantly, what most folks don't see is how many wonderful people are living in these communities, just trying to find a way, trying to better our lives. But oftentimes we don't have examples. I never met a person that went to college, let alone graduated from college, except for my teachers. Maybe. Wow. I mean, one of the schools that I went to, I don't know if the teachers even graduated, to be honest. It was I remember this very distinct moment. I was in third grade, Mr. Ewing, shout out to my teacher, Mr. Ewing. And we had art class. You'd leave your class for like one thing. And I remember distinctly, Mr. Dillon was the art teacher, and they wheeled in a television into the classroom and put on 48 Hours with Eddie Murphy and Nick Nolte, and left and went to get high. All right. This is true story. Hamilton Elementary School in St. Louis, Missouri.
Great example, in terms of comedic sensibilities, not so great in terms of education and let's quote unquote wellness.
Maybe that's where I get it, my sense of humor. But coming from this environment, again, I was at that time, I was on the school lunch program, the free lunch program. I had this little red ticket. And as soon as I get there in the day, this is my opportunity to get breakfast. Sometimes we didn't have that much money at home, and we get money from, food from quote food pantries and charitable organizations and things like that. We're on public assistance. And there's another misnomer that people aren't working hard. My stepfather was the head chef at Morton's of Chicago, in St. Louis. And my mother worked overnight at a convenience store just to make ends meet, and because we're kind of just always behind the ball, having 3 mouths to feed. And my mother, actually, one incident, and I talked about this in my latest book, Eat Smarter, which, by the way, I'm very happy to say my publisher just sent me the message on Monday that despite all of the mayhem that took place in about 4 weeks of press that I did, Eat Smarter was the #1 bestseller in the United States when it came out, the week that it came out.
Incredible.
And it's a national USA Today national bestseller. It sold 100,000 copies, 102,000 copies to be exact. In that short blitz of, thank you so much. And, we'll talk more about that and really, but the culmination from that book, the seed started in those moments, living in that environment, because as my mom is trying to make ends meet, working overnight at this convenience store, one night she got robbed and she was stabbed several times. And my mom's just a tough, if people saw my mom, knew my mom today, she's like a Wolverine, we call her Wolverine, but she ended up subduing the guy until the police showed up. But just constant, issues that we're facing just to get by in this environment. So, I want to kind of break some frameworks that people have about people who are in these conditions. I'm coming out of the gate kind of behind the ball and just trying to figure things out. But here's the point. Once I get an example of what's possible, that's when good stuff starts to happen. And so I go through my life, I saw my way out of the conditions I was in playing sports. And, I was a scholar athlete, performing great on the football field and on the track. But at 15 years old, I was doing a time trial during track season. And I ran a 4.540 when I was 15, by the way.
Holy shit.
So I'm doing a time trial with my coach, 200-meter sprint. And as I'm coming off the curve into the straightaway, my hip breaks. I broke my hip, the iliac crest in my hip. And at the time, I didn't know what happened. I'd never been injured before, but I just kind of came up lame, was limping a little bit. I kept coming to practice for a couple of days and I couldn't get my legs to turn over. Eventually got the scan done. The physician puts it up for me to see. Oh, there's the problem. My bone was kind of floating off in space. And at that moment, he's like, oh, we're going to get you some crutches, some NSAIDs. They even gave me this cool little Whirlpool thing, adapter to put on my bathtub at home. He's like, you'll get better. But he didn't stop to ask, how did a kid break his hip from just running?
A 15-year-old breaking their hip. Isn't that the injury that took out Bo Jackson?
No, his was definitely more severe. His was definitely more severe. So mine was just a fracture of the tip of my hip. And basically what happened for me was I pulled a muscle and my bones were so brittle, the bone just kind of came off with it. And so that's what I didn't learn until 5 years later. When I was 20 years old, I finally get this diagnosis after injury after injury kept me off the football field. And I get this diagnosis of degenerative disc disease and basically an advanced arthritic condition of my spine and of my bones, to put it simply for folks. And so getting this news at the age of 20, when my whole life is in front of me, and I think I'm about to, I'm in my prime of life years.
Sure.
My physician at the time, my physician at the time, same scenario, puts the scan up for me to see. And I was used to 15-year-old scenario, like, okay, tell me what to do to get better. Let's go. Let's get back to the game. And with that kind of inspiration that I still had, he kind of like literally reached his hand out, kind of like, slow down. And he said these words. He said, I'm sorry, son, this is incurable. This is something that you're going to have to learn to live with.
Wow. And
my brain didn't register. Like, I actually asked him again, like, I was like, okay, so does this have anything to do with what I'm eating? Should I change the way I'm exercising? And I had no context really to ask him that question, except my nutritional science class that I had in school, which I thought was about fitness. And he told me these are exact words. This has nothing to do with what you're eating. This is something that just happens. And I'm sorry that it happened to you. Now, the ironic part is that he told me this has nothing to do with what I'm eating, but then he wrote me a prescription to eat some pills. Right. And so I was just talking with, and we mentioned this right before we got started. I was just talking with Dr. John Abramson, a wonderful professor out of Harvard. He teaches healthcare policy and also many years as a physician.
And one of the top medical, I believe, the kind of pharmaceutical litigation experts in America.
Yes. I mean, he knows where the bodies are buried. Like, no doubt. Been through a lot of stuff. But he's just a really lighthearted, optimistic guy still, despite all the stuff that he's seen. And one of the things that we talked about was this forgotten issue that took place just a few years back with Vioxx. And so when I'm 20 years old, sitting in that doctor's office, the two hot NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that were the top picks were Celebrex and Vioxx. And he could have put me on either one. He put me on Celebrex, which I ended up having side effects from. But Vioxx ended up, after years of litigation, ended up killing upwards of 60,000 Americans.
Yeah.
And they had over 120,000 cardiovascular events documented from taking Vioxx. That Merck then at that time, they actually found, which is, it's a normalcy. They were able to basically kind of shift away the peer-reviewed data that they provided to the New England Journal of Medicine, because that's how they were selling the drug, was going to doctors saying, hey, look, we got this study in the New England Journal of Medicine. This drug has reduces the risk of gastrointestinal problems, which was the issue with, things like ibuprofen, for example. So it's better than that. And it relieves pain better. Neither of those things were shown in their clinical data. and also the thing that they hid, they were able to basically manipulate the data that they shared. They basically hid the fact that there was a dramatic increase in cardiovascular events that took place in their own clinical trials. There's about a 3 times higher risk, which is not just 2 times, 3 times higher is substantial. You know, and even young people in their 20s had strokes or heart attack and died from this drug. And I could have been in that field.
Yeah, to just frame this for everybody out there, and this was, you know, this is something that was discussed on Shawn's recent podcast, like I said, with John Abramson, one of the top pharmaceutical litigation experts. The episode was titled "The Shocking Truth About Drug Companies and How They've Destroyed American Health." And so, in Shawn's case, 20 years old, highly conditioned, you know, highly tuned athlete, having some muscular and bone issues, and goes to a physician, gets diagnosed, and there are 2 anti-inflammatory drugs that most doctors and physicians were prescribing for these types of infirmaries at the time. Shawn got the one that was relatively safer. The other one resulted in the deaths of 60,000 people. It's called Vioxx, and was the basis for, I believe, the largest pharmaceutical product liability malpractice case in American history, if not the biggest, definitely one of the biggest.
Yes, at that time. Since worse things have happened, you know, which we can get into today. But this is the bottom line from that piece of the story, is that Merck literally and knowingly put this product on the market and killed people. And even as the time was going on, that more and more of these issues were coming up, they kept finding ways to creatively hide their liability, in such that no one went to jail. Their fines were a slap on the wrist, and they were able to continue operating in business. They weren't kind of taken out of this kind of medical care system, the healthcare system, which if we killed 10 people, let alone 100, let alone 1,000, let alone, we're talking 60,000 American lives. Yeah. This business should not exist anymore. But guess what? Merck is doing better than ever. They're about to launch their new COVID pill, and they're primed to make another blockbuster drug. And this is the nature of it. You know, as you know very well, the way that the system is set up as far as litigation, they have some of the most powerful lawyers, you know, legal teams on planet Earth, who help to put into place policy that shields them so remarkably from these issues, where they can create, for example, be able to do a certain type of bankruptcy to reduce liability. Like, there's all kinds of loopholes. Yeah,
there's a lot of, for sure. I mean, I'm not a medical malpractice or a civil litigation attorney, but I'm definitely familiar with a lot of this stuff. And as we'll get to within the context of the pandemic and the vaccine, definitely some gaming of the system to reduce liability. And listen, I mean, liability there is always going to be a game played with liability caps in terms of creating drugs and medical care, because you've got to incentivize people to do it. If the and their argument, at least, is if the malpractice risk is too high, then why are we creating these drugs in the first place? And you're going to stifle innovation. But they get very creative about how to avoid liability. And there's other products, like there's product liability for a kid's toy. Right. If that doesn't work, okay, maybe someone gets a bump or a bruise. If it's your kid doesn't get to use their micro machine, or God, I can't just believe I brought up micro machines. Anyways, but God knows what. When there's product defects in the pharmaceutical world and medicine, people die. And in this case, lots of people died. And it's a kind of a blurry line between civil liability and criminal liability. And they don't seem to have any criminal liability where their negligence, and in many cases, risks and defects that they either one were aware of or two should have been aware of. There's no criminal liability for them being in part of the chain of causation of a person dying. And that's super problematic. But so in terms of, we're going to get to public health in a second, in terms of you, so essentially you were diagnosed with this infirmary. You had a limited amount of good examples of health and wellness and nutrition, that you were exposed to in your childhood because of where you grew up. And so that's one of the things that a lot of people don't acknowledge about, some working class neighborhoods, that to a certain, they've got bigger health issues because they don't have as much access to knowledge and good examples, but two, access, their natural environment is simply unhealthier. So I imagine after this diagnosis, when you were 20, you went and became an autodidact, learning everything you could and really taking personal agency over your wellness and your fitness.
That is not what happened, but
Really?
shortly thereafter did happen.
Fair enough.
Took
fair
some
enough.
time because it's always going to be up to the individual, because I
Sure.
could have packed it in at that time and nobody would blame me. I've got this so-called incurable condition and I'm in pain. This is when I'm living in Ferguson, 1-bedroom apartment. My mattress is on the floor, and I'm eating fast food every day because it's cheap and it's accessible. And, of course it tastes good, but that's all that I knew. I didn't know that there was a difference between, a fish sandwich from McDonald's and wild caught salmon. Like it's just all food. I had no context.
Or even a Big
really
Mac and a
mattered.
grass-fed burger.
Right. For me, there's no differentiation
Burger's
between them.
burger.
Even when in my high, I went to a private university for the first college that I went to. Very expensive school, auditorium, nutritional science class, the whole thing. And what we really talked about was really some false premises around what nutrition is, really built on this calorie focused model and not the actual nutrition that is coming through the food. And so 2 years go by of this time, so I'm from the age of 20 to 22, and I'm still doing the same things that put me in this condition, because the question is, how could a young kid have this advanced arthritic condition that's usually relegated to people who are in their 70s and 80s and beyond?
Yeah.
And, the physician actually told me I had the spine of an 80-year-old man. And what happened was I was accelerating my aging process. My body was deteriorating because I simply wasn't providing the raw materials that my body needed to regenerate my tissues, namely of which for me at that instance was my intervertebral disc. And so one day, and it took again 2 years, and at this point doing the same thing over and over and being told by each physician that I saw, bed rest, don't do anything, be careful, here's some more drugs.
Yeah.
I gained a lot of weight. I was always the one skinny one in my family. I was the skinny kid in my family, but I know a ton about the Human Genome Project and epigenetics and all that stuff, but my fat genes that were dormant kicked in. And so I'm a lot heavier, really not even recognizing myself in the mirror. My mental state is just trash at this point.
Yeah.
And it was really when, again, rock bottom is a really good place to stand up on sometimes, and so after these couple of years of struggling, it occurred to me finally after I saw, because I would go get another opinion from different physicians, hoping to hear a different answer. I was really looking for somebody to save me. I was looking for one of them to say, I've got you, I'm going to fix this, but they all said the same thing. And one day it hit me that unfortunately, they're literally telling me that they can't help me. And yet I keep going to them. So when you seek a second opinion, just for everybody moving forward, by the way, so I just talked with Tony Robbins on Monday too, which is really cool.
Love it.
But he shared with me this new, and he actually, in his book, he shared a stat that I shared with him back earlier on about some of this pandemic related stuff. But he shared a stat in the book that was staggering. I went and dug into it more from the Mayo Clinic. And the study found that essentially when somebody gets a diagnosis and then they seek out a second opinion, only 12% of the time is it the same diagnosis. Only 12% of the time is it the exact same diagnosis from the first person to the next physician. And 21% of the time, the diagnosis is dramatically different distinctly, it was the word that they used, distinctly different from the first person. So much about our healthcare system, it seems so very solid and science-based, but it's a whole lot of fucking opinion. And that's the problem, because all of these opinions, it just depends on which opinion you get caught up in.
Absolutely.
And your life could be on the line.
And the way that I've heard the criticism described very astutely during this pandemic is false consensus. Is that you'll hear a medical professional or someone from the medical community state something as if it's gospel, and if there is a consensus on this drug, this methodology, what have you, and it's not true. It's just one of a variety of opinions. And if there's anything we saw over the last couple of years, it's people trying to kind of frame their own personal diagnoses and decisions as something that everybody agrees with, that there's a community consensus on, and that's simply not true. And as we've seen with the history of in those numbers that you just mentioned about so much fragmentation and differing opinions within the medical community.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening. And, where this all, the tables turn and the story, spoiler alert, it's a good ending to the story. But it was after seeing the fourth physician and giving you the same bill of goods that I got before. So when you're seeking that second opinion, just for everybody else, learning from my experience, you want to seek a second opinion from somebody who has the same goal as you, who believes that if you just was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, for example, that you don't have to have the condition, and they want to work with you so that you don't have the condition. But I asked, okay, what can I do to get healthy? That was the first question that I asked. What is it that I need to do to feel better? That was the exact question. The second question was, okay, what are my discs made of? What are my bones made of? The cookie cutter thing that popped up was from marketing, which was calcium, right? Milk does a body good, drink your calcium, milk mustache, the whole thing.
Great marketing.
So when I was in college still at the time, so I was able to just go to the lab and just look at some papers, and I found out there was like 20 things that were way more important than calcium, that your body can't even absorb calcium without these other cofactors. And I was like, I never heard of any of this shit. And this definitely wasn't taught to me in my university nutritional science class that I paid for, about my bone density and what actually makes up human tissues. And so I found out what these things were. And I just, honestly, the first step that I did, I became a natural pill popper. All right. So I was just like, okay, I need these omega-3s. I need this chromium. I need these sulfur bearing amino acids. And I just started to consume the nutrients in their isolated forms. Eventually, that got very expensive. And also the light bulb came on very quickly, actually. And I started to investigate who's have these things. And I basically just started to flood my tissues with these really high quality foods that had all of these compounds that I literally was never getting at all. I was just barely surviving on the way that I was eating. I was eating fake processed foods essentially every meal of my life, when I was at that point in college. And so once I started to change what I was making my tissues out of, I started to get better a whole lot faster, coupled with, and here's the last part of the story, I came across a study on racehorses, of all things, and bone density. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, by the way. And if a racehorse breaks a bone, like this is grounds, like you could lose tens of millions of dollars. So they were doing studies to see how to increase the horse's bone density. So they had a control group who basically they did nothing with. They had a study group that they gave the horses supplements, kind of like what I was doing initially. And they did increase their bone density with supplements. But then they had another group that received supplements and they walked the horses. And they had an even higher, a more dramatic increase in their bone density. So there was something special about exercise. And that's the problem in our society. And part of this health complex that humans are experiencing today. We don't really understand that our genes expect us to move. Exercise is not about getting a six pack or, a Brazilian bubble butt or whatever. It's about assimilation of nutrients, and it's about elimination. Exercise is critical. Movement is critical to move your lymphatic system, this kind of extracellular waste management system. So if you're not moving, you're literally starting to just retain metabolic waste like a cesspool, and all of your metabolic functioning starts to decline. And I was not moving because, again, I was in fear and I was in pain. I was in pain. So I just started to do what I could. This didn't mean I went and deadlifted 400 pounds, which I did later, by the way, I was able to do. But I just started to just walk or go onto a recumbent bicycle. I was in a lot of pain. But as I was doing this, I started feeling better and better and better. And then my sleep improved, which was the hardest thing in those 2 years, was sleeping at night. I'd wake up every couple of hours, sciatic pain shooting down my leg. It was terrifying. I was on more drugs just to sleep at night, And so now that I'm doing things good for myself during the day, it started to help me sleep better in the evening. 6 weeks after making that decision to get well, it was as if I had never been injured in the first place. The pain was gone. I lost about 18 pounds, which again, I was a quote skinny kid. So the weight just kind of flew off me once I started getting in alignment with what my genes were expecting of me. So this result's not typical for everybody. But from there, shortly thereafter, within the upcoming months, people started coming up to me at my university, which I went from a 15 credit load to down to 3 credits, like one class, just barely hanging on. I was embarrassed and I was in pain just getting around campus. Now I'm feeling better. The next semester is kicking off, back to 12 credit load. People are coming up to me and they're like fellow students. My teachers would stop me. Like, what did you do? You look so healthy. They didn't just see a person who lost weight. They saw somebody who was actually radiantly healthy versus I look at those old pictures of myself. I look like a dying human being. I I looked like a ghost of myself. And so they became my first clients. I became a strength and conditioning coach. I graduated after I got my degree, shifted all my coursework back to like biology and kinesiology and nutritional science, opened up my clinical practice as a nutritionist, worked with countless people in that. A lot of times people with chronic illnesses were told the same thing that I was told. There's nothing you could do. We saw great success. So even seeing, for example, type 2 diabetes, which at the time, I've been in this field for 20 years now, it was considered that this was, quote, incurable. Like and it's just simply not the case. Now it's well noted that you can reverse this condition. It's understanding what's happening with the beta cells in the pancreas and your insulin sensitivity of the cells and the liver and the metabolism of the insulin and all these different things that I would teach people. I'd give them the time to sit down with them and to teach them about their bodies and to find out how do they get in this situation in the first place and find leverage so they can actually do the things necessary, which unfortunately, even if we have the best intentions in our healthcare system today, many of my colleagues working as physicians, they don't have the time. They're working in volume just to keep the lights on, so actually seeing people do well. And from that, the books have come about. Sleep Smarter was my first book. I wrote that book. I'm a nutritionist. The sleep expert part came out of necessity. I had no idea there wasn't a resource like this. I know friends of mine who are, America's Sleep Doctor and these different monikers. A book had never done this well. It's international bestsellers, 21 different languages it's translated into. And we're knocking on the door of 500,000 copies sold of this book that's on this fringe idea that the publishers were just still skeptical about because a sleep book had never done well before. And it changed culture. And this is why I'm here with you today, because I know how everybody listening right now, I understand how powerful we are. I'm a guy from Ferguson, Missouri, and my books are in libraries in China. That's how powerful we are to affect change and affect culture. And right now, what's happening in the world, it really is a result of we've been allowing things to go on all this time for a couple of decades now and seeing the decline in the health of our communities. And we just accepted and normalized this shit, and it's not okay. Now it's bringing it all to the surface. And it's a great thing because we get to say, nope, enough is enough. We know that with COVID, for example, the number one that published by the CDC on July 1st, 2021, they did a massive meta-analysis of 800 US hospitals and over 540,000 COVID-19 patients. They found that the leading risk factor, the number one risk factor for death was obesity. We know this already. We've been saying this since the very beginning. And the CDC, which is everybody's pointing to listen to the CDC, they're saying it with their own mouth. But here's the other thing, and we'll talk about this too. The second leading risk factor in that study for death from COVID-19 was anxiety and fear-related disorders. That's the second leading risk factor for death. And we'll talk about neuroimmunology and how that's even possible. Third leading cause of death was diabetes and related metabolic disorders. So
and
that's
Shawn,
where we are.
I think some people don't quite understand the extent of the obesity and diabetes epidemic in America. I mean, just the sheer volume, the pure numbers of people who qualify as either diabetic, pre-diabetic, or obese is quite shocking. Can you tell us a little bit about that and its trajectory over the past 30, 35 years? Because I've heard you mention it, and I think that, it's the type of thing that is kind of subconscious for people when they might go watch an old movie from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and kind of their mind does somewhere process that, oh, wait, everybody here in these movies is skinny. Right. And then you compare that to what we see now. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the pure extent of those two issues.
Absolutely. So we'll just say we'll just use a short framework, the last 100 years from 1920s up till 1970s, the rate of obesity remained actually pretty consistent, somewhere in the ballpark around 15%. All right. 12 to 15% obesity. All right. But something really crazy happened in the 80s. Our obesity rate tripled. It tripled in a decade. And from there, it's been no looking back. Today, right now in the United States, about 45%. And actually, this was pre-COVID, which we know it's already happened. We can talk about some of the data from that.
Yeah.
45% of our citizens are clinically obese. All right. That to break down these numbers, we're knocking on the door. We have almost 250 million American citizens are either overweight or obese right now. It is insane.
Yeah.
And this was something, again, it was a rarity just a couple of decades ago. Something has happened. And with that, we have about 130 million Americans are either type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic right now. And on top of that, we know that, okay, so what is the big issue here? We have this movement towards body acceptance. And this is a beautiful thing because no human being, we should not be cookie cutter. Everybody has the same ideal body type. We have all kinds of shapes and sizes. It's what's happening when we venture into the state of being pre-diabetic or diabetic and being obese, of the absolute damage and rapid breakdown that takes place in the human body. 9 of the top 10 leading causes of death in the United States, 9 of the top 10 are directly related to insulin resistance and excessive weight, making those conditions far worse. We know this by far. So heart disease is the number one killer most years in the United States across the board. So we're talking about taking the whole population into consideration, because it's actually opioids are the leading cause of death for people between the age of 18 and 45 as of this last year.
Another fact I think people are going to find shocking. They figured it was kind of a niche, a niche hazard, a niche concern. No, it's the number one cause of death. It's crazy.
It makes no sense. Specifically, we're talking about fentanyl. It's a synthetic opioid being the leading cause of death for people in their, quote, prime of life years. But across the board, heart disease is the number one cause of death for many years. And 60% of our citizens today, 60% have some degree of heart disease already. We're a ticking time bomb. And underneath all of this is like, yes, let's have a movement towards self-love and body acceptance. Couple that with, let's not act like this shit isn't killing people, specifically killing people in the communities that I come from. Yeah. Because Black women have the highest ratio of obesity of any culture, of any citizen in the United States. Almost 50% of Black women are obese. This is my aunts. This is my mom. This is the people that I grew up with. And these are good people. We just don't know any better. And so we're coming up in these conditions where we have food manufacturers, for example, and I broke all this stuff down. This is why Eat Smarter is such an important book. I went and broke down, like, how do we get in this situation in the first place? And there was a great study. This was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So JAMA, one of our most prestigious journals. And what they did was, and because for me, I'm a curious person. I have a healthy level of skepticism, and I'm just asking questions. And so I know that our government has spent literally billions of dollars, about $170 billion on agricultural subsidies, all right, to help to feed Americans. That's how it started off, which might have been of good intentions. But the vast majority of that money is going towards these cash crops that are largely showing up through the drive-through window and through processed foods: corn, soy, wheat, sugar, things that are used for processed foods. And so, okay, so we know this already. That's a huge red flag. That's a problem. But does it translate? Do we have data that it translates to worse health for our citizens? And so the study that was published in JAMA tracked the people who had the highest consumption of government subsidized foods. And they found that people who ate the most government subsidized foods had a 40% greater incidence of developing obesity. All right. So it was 37% to be exact, but almost 40% increased incidence of becoming obese. Our government, the way that things are set up right now, is literally feeding the fucking problem. And then instead of treating the underlying issue, we get doled out medications to suppress symptoms. And everybody is making money off the farming of sick people. And it's not okay. It's not okay. And this is, again, right now is a great time to be alive because we can see this stuff. We've got the data and we have the audacity to do something about it.
It does feel like in response to the natural environment becoming more toxic and the odds stacking up against us over the past 25 to 35 years, in terms of these, the government subsidizing unhealthy inputs and ingredients, portion sizes exploding, and people not having, the just naturally their calorie consumption seems to kind of drift with the larger portion sizes and more availability of food. It feels like, much like with yourself, in response to greater health concerns and risks, you took it upon yourself to educate, to get more educated. It does feel like the communal knowledge, like we know more about, at least at the top of the funnel, we know more about health, wellness, and how to, as you say, live in concert with our genes, what our genes expect of us, than we ever have before. Now it's just about getting that knowledge out more broadly and implementing it.
Absolutely. That you said it perfectly. The data exists, but we've got to understand, and this is what we're seeing right now. There's a lot of turbulence taking place. And a big part of that is understanding the systems that are at play that are, again, these are multi-billion-dollar entities that are making a tremendous amount of income that are dependent upon you being sick. They're not just going to go quietly into the night. It's like, this is not going to happen. There isn't going to be a solution for an infectious disease that does not fill the pockets of pharmaceutical companies in a major way. That's not happening. You can forget about that. It's an opportunity. These are opportunistic, kind of parasitic entities that have long track records of felonies, like documented, literally felonies, death, fraud. Pfizer, for example, they were ordered to pay the largest healthcare fraud settlement in the history of the Department of Justice. All right. And they were charged with racketeering, like RICO charges, which is relegated to organized crime. Right. This is the first time this has ever happened for a pharmaceutical company. But nobody knows this. People don't know this. They're just watching the news, sponsored by Pfizer. They're a criminal organization. This doesn't mean that they can't do something good, for sure. But we have to be open to that.
You look at it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Are you with me and a bunch of other people, one of these things that kind of gets filed subconsciously? The pharmaceutical commercials at the end, some fast talking individual rattles off a litany of potential side effects, and it's almost comical. I mean, sometimes the description of the side effects goes on for 15, 20 seconds when they're talking faster than a human being should talk. I mean, that seems kind of disturbing.
We live in the greatest nation in the world. We still do, because of our freedoms. And of course, these are being infringed upon right now. But part of that, there's a freedom of expression. There's an ability to, have freedom of speech. And so this is what these pharmaceutical entities are leaning into, for their ability to have free speech in talking to you on television. All right. So it's a little, again, finding a loophole for this, because there are only two wealthy nations that allow pharmaceutical companies to promote direct to consumer: the United States and New Zealand. All right. But New Zealand has much higher standards of efficacy on what's allowed to be said. Here in the United States, that freedom of speech has ventured into psychological manipulation. And I don't say these terms lightly. I don't want it to be the case, but when they're playing beautiful, soothing music while rattling off all of those side effects, anal bleeding, diabetes, death, like they're just saying these things in this beautiful, soothing way. All the while you're watching this imagery and you're like, because people want that. They've seen that beautiful imagery is something we aspire towards. And so we're having this cognitive association that this drug might help me get there. It's bordering on being, the word that comes to mind. Yes, manipulative. But I was going to say preying on people's natural intentions and good intentions on being happy and healthy.
And this is what the advertising industry has done for decades. It's their bread and butter, right? But as you mentioned, it's kind of, we accept, most countries in the Western world accept that there should be a free market, and companies that are involved in commercial activity should be able to engage in these type of advertising tricks, right? But once again, if you're selling clothing or freaking kitchenware or God knows what, okay, society, there's less fallout from allowing corporations to use these marketing tricks to kind of manipulate people's best intentions, right? But when you're talking about medicine and pharmaceutical inventions, once again, you're really dealing with people's health. And when you're allowing companies to kind of prey on their best instincts with these manipulative tactics in this sphere, it's just the cost benefit no longer works out, it seems like.
Yeah, you just said it so well. You just said such an important term, which is having a simple cost benefit analysis or risk benefit assessment. These are basic things that I was taught in conventional education, but really more so working as a research scientist, being able to take huge amounts of peer-reviewed data and to be able to sift through it. And because here's the thing, as humans, we naturally have biases, and that's okay. But we don't understand oftentimes that we have these biases. And so we're constantly looking for things to affirm what we believe already. And so the very best scientists have the ability to put our biases to the side and proactively look for ways that I'm wrong. And even if folks don't like the outcome, you know, the small minority of folks that might not agree with all of the peer-reviewed data that I could provide, it's because it's rubbing against their bias, because I'm taking all the data. I don't want to have a dog in the fight, whether it's for vaccine efficacy or whether it's for mask and these things that have become so contentious. What I'm doing is I'm looking at what does the majority of high quality peer-reviewed data show? Because these are things that seem to be been lost recently, that we had accepted they should be a given, that a randomized controlled trial that has a specific implement and a specific outcome, the gold standard, a placebo-controlled randomized controlled trial at that this should hold rank over observational data with massive confounding factors and biases, and does not show causation. Mm-hmm. Because right now what's happening, even as the vaccine efficacy story has devolved, it went from, you know, and the clips of our health officials and, you know, even the president of the United States have been out for everybody. I've been talking about this since the beginning, saying that this stops transmission, saying that this reduces viral load. Both of these things were proven to be unequivocally untrue. And I'm saying this from real peer-reviewed data. And here's the thing, this data that is getting published in peer-reviewed journals, they don't want to publish data going against that. That's when you know, like, okay, all right, there's probably some integrity here. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, instead of acknowledging that, that whole conversation disappears. And now they really double down on, well, at least it offers protection and it reduces hospitalizations. Now, here's what people don't understand. That is from observational data that does not show causation, period. And once it's out in the world, in the quote, real world, this is where we have easily manipulated evidence take place to the degree that we ignore what the clinical data says. Now, in the very beginning, when the mRNA trials were completed, the first thing that I did was reach out to an epidemiologist who's doing great work out in Canada at Waterloo University, Dr. Ron Brown, who had a peer-reviewed published paper that I was shocked that got published, analyzing, and the title of the paper is essentially the outcome reporting bias in the mRNA vaccine trials. And we had this conversation, and I brought him on and we talked about it. We walked through it. And what he did was he looked at, and he was shocked, because when I first heard the numbers, 95% effective, 94% effective, I was like, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I know the history. So let me hold back my cheerleading for it and walk into this with healthy skepticism and see how does this actually line up. And so here's what he found. The 94% effectiveness, 95% effectiveness of Moderna and Pfizer respectively, those are the relative risk reductions. And with relative risk reduction, this is a valid, and the numbers are true. This is a valid statistic to use, but it's used more in clinical
and so, Shawn,
comparison.
There's relative risk reduction versus total risk reduction. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we'll get right to this. So it's absolute risk reduction. So relative risk reduction, or the RR, this is a number that is looking at a data set that is more comparable to something that we would use comparing this trial to another, something like that. This isn't something that translates to the real world, which that number is called the absolute risk reduction. An absolute risk reduction is your risk reduction as an individual from this said treatment. Okay, in this case, this mRNA vaccine. The absolute risk reduction for you as an individual with the Pfizer vaccine was not 95%. It wasn't 90%. It wasn't even 5%. It wasn't even 1%. It was a 0.7% absolute risk reduction for you as an individual in the real world. Mm-hmm. You have a less than 1% reduced risk of, now here's the thing, risk of what? Reduced risk of what? Of contracting and having mild symptoms. Mm. Because the vaccines did not show reductions in hospitalizations and reductions in death. The clinical trial data did not show that shit. And it's just like, it's just been completely forgotten. If that was the case, I'd be all for it. And I would be happy as a lark to spread the good news. But this is not what was shown in the clinical trial data. It helped to reduce mild symptoms.
And I'd love to get into this. Oh, sorry, continue.
So that was 0.7. And for Moderna, it was 1.1% absolute risk reduction. And again, you can maybe drop this in the show notes. People could check out the study. If you want to, it's a ton of data. There's an abstract, which is most people are leaning into. But if you go through the trial data, and you understand this, you're looking through this lens of skepticism and really let me run the numbers here. For him, he couldn't believe it. He just sat there in silence for a minute. He could not believe the framing that was taking place. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to share with this, is that the 95 and 94% risk reduction is true. It is true. But that's what we do, and what we allow is the manipulation and the framing of data for our citizens who don't have any context of what that fucking means.
Sure.
And so I'm very passionate about this subject because, again, I just want people to have the full data set so that they can make a true informed consent choice for what they're doing with their bodies. And, now we're leaning on observational data when the clinical trial data showed, number one, this isn't going to work that well. Guess what? We're still dealing with this because it didn't stop transmission, which is what the promise was. Yeah. And they didn't apologize. They didn't say, you know what, we got it wrong. They just kept on changing the story, moving the goalposts, and to the point where people are we've already outsourced ourselves and so invested in them telling the truth for the people who believed it, that they just adjust. They just buy, okay, well, I guess I'll just I just need a fourth. I need a booster. And by the way, the word booster, last thing I'm going to say, what a booster means is another vaccine. It's like a softer blow to the term. That means you need another one. Yeah. You need another one. And it's just something has been lost clearly.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about in terms of what particularly irks me is that they never own up to it. They never acknowledge. And then they always, because they believe they're on the side of the righteous, that their message, that because they're encouraging people to be more cautious and to make more steps in the direction of caution, that they think that the actual precision and accuracy of the information that they give us doesn't matter, because they think, much like I mentioned earlier with false consensus, that the two twin pillars of public health validity, legitimacy issues are false consensus and noble lies. That they tell us noble lies and thinking that we don't know enough, and we're not capable of making the best decisions in furtherance of our own health. Thus, we need to be steered in as long as they're directionally correct, they don't have to actually be accurate. That seems to be what's happening over and over and over again. And in particular, it was put one of the public health voices who's been particularly good over the course of this pandemic is a guy named Jay Bhattacharya. And he's consistently owned up, and tried to be more forthright about the risk, reward, and cost benefit analysis. And one thing that he said recently in terms of why public health has taken such a hit in trust, he's quoted, "Public health has become a laughingstock because it has forgotten that the health of the public extends far beyond just infection control. Public health has acted as if the people should serve it rather than it serving the people." And I imagine that comment resonates with you very strongly.
Absolutely. And, again, I don't have a dog in the fight. I do understand human physiology at a level that, this is my life. This is what I do every day. So, of course, I'm going to understand that, probably the best thing for humans are the things that our genes expect from us, that our DNA expects from us, that we've evolved with, real food, movement, high quality rest, access to fresh air and sunlight, these type of things. Absolutely. But I'm still open to the fact that maybe the sun is the worst thing ever, even though it helped to create, life here on this planet. Maybe that big flaming ball is just like an asshole who's trying to kill everybody. This is what makes me different, is over time, I've allowed myself to be wrong and open the door to being wrong. And when you do that, you tend to be right more often. And it's because I have this ability to take a proper risk benefit assessment in these scenarios, and not having a dog in the fight, looking at the data here, with this vaccine rollout. And I see, again, Pfizer's making $40 billion this year. It's like, it's become this massive cash cow. People like you just mentioned, who are coming forward and saying, you know what? The data that we're being shown here, this isn't the whole story. Let's take a look at this and here's what I wanted to share with you, because I just actually shared this yesterday. This is a great example of a simple cost benefit analysis. And this is here in California, as of this recording right now, millions of N95 masks have been shipped to California schools, all right, for our children. And the N95 masks, and specifically the biggest school district here, Sacramento Unified School District, each teacher is getting 20 N95 masks. And in this particular article, this is, Yahoo News. I just try to find like a major news site who's talking about it, and then we'll go into what the real science says. And they said doctors say the tighter fitting mask might take some time to get used to, but they urge that students go outside and get some fresh air if needed. All right. So they want kids to be in masks. Now, they're disallowing in this school district cloth masks. All right. Why now? Why after almost 2 years? And you telling us wear something, anything works, cloth masks are fine. The very first thing that I did, this is back in early 2020, I went and I shared the peer-reviewed data because it seemed kind of logical for me. Like if you cover your mouth, like with something, is probably going to stop the spread of like aerosols and droplets, whatever. But is it actually stopping viral transmission, which viruses are infinitesimally small? And so it's just like, is this a surface level thing or what does the data show? And so what I did was I went to a study, and this was published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. And this was a cluster randomized controlled trial of cloth mask compared to medical mask, AKA surgical mask, in healthcare workers. This included a nice data set. It was 1,600 people in 14 hospitals. And these are people who are versed in doing the thing and reporting accurately. And so they were randomized into three arms. They had to wear them at all times on their work shift, by the way. So one arm wore the surgical mask, one arm wore cloth mask, and the other one had standard practice, which is you might put it on sometimes during the day if you're going to see somebody who might have an infectious disease, but then you take it off. Now, the laboratory results were blinded and laboratory testing was conducted in a blinded fashion. All good things. This is a good data set. All right. Yep. Now, here's what they found. Healthcare workers wearing cloth masks were about 13 times more likely to experience an influenza-like illness than those wearing surgical masks. Mm-hmm. 13 times, not 2 times, not 5 times, not 10 times, 13 times more likely to get sick. In the study, again, this was a randomized controlled trial. The researchers were trying to find out like what's going on here with these cloth masks. And here's what they said. This is their quote. Moisture retention, reuse of cloth masks, and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection. This mask can increase your risk of infection. Does anybody fucking care? Like, can we just talk about this? Crazy. I said this at the very beginning because they were like, there are no randomized controlled trials, whatever. No, there is. And that's just one of the studies. I'll share this one really, really quickly.
Sure.
This one, and this is like the goal. This is like the LeBron James of these mask trials. This one I'm about to share. Again, this was published early on. This is prior to all this politicization and craziness is taking place. This was a meta-analysis of 19 randomized controlled trials. And again, a randomized controlled trial is taking a specific implement, in this case being a face mask, looking at a specific outcome. Does the person get sick? So we know that this was the treatment versus an observational study, which is like, it seems like these people over here might have had some benefit from doing this thing. We don't really know because we didn't implement this strategy. We're just kind of watching to see, and that has automatic bias, confounding factors, things that we don't take into consideration. Like, okay, so these people over here that are doing this thing, were they in a different age group, or was it, their rate, their chronic diseases?
Are there other variables that are that led to the results, right? Were there other causal factors?
What environments were they in? Whereas we have a controlled environment here for the most part, being these hospital healthcare settings. So this was published in the International Journal of Nursing Studies. This included 8 community settings, 6 healthcare settings, and 5 as source control. And so now here's what the study said. Now, this is very important because the wording here, this is the problem with people who don't do this for a living, going and looking at a study, and they're just going to be fishing for something that makes them, that affirms their bias. All right. So what they said was most of these randomized controlled trials use different interventions and outcome measures. In the community, this is important. This is going to sound a little bit different for what it's going to end up being. In the community, mask appeared to be effective with and without hand hygiene. Okay. And both together were more effective. That sounds good. Sounds like we got some benefit in the community. Randomized controlled trials in healthcare workers showed that respirators in 95s, if worn continually during the shift without taking them off, but not worn if they took them off at any point, not worn intermittently, had benefit. Medical mask, surgical mask in 19 randomized controlled trials, this is the exact words, medical masks were not effective. Cloth mask, even less effective. All right. First of all, we should be like, what is less effective and not effective? Because that's what cloth masks were. That means that there's a potential problem here. Now, here's where the confusion can take place, because you could see like, oh, they said that in the community, it appears, this is the key word, appears. It's a very, very strong word. And why would scientists use a word like this? The conclusion, and here was the conclusion of the study had, which is where the bias of researchers can take place. They said that the study suggests that community mask use by well people could be beneficial, particularly for COVID-19, where transmission may be pre-symptomatic. Now, this is a lot of very loose language. And here's what I did. I went and I took days, a long time, and being somebody who's versed as a research scientist understanding this stuff, I went through every single one of these references, all 19 of the studies. And I'm just going to read off some of them for you, because in the community, they said that it appeared to have some effectiveness. The first one, this was published by Cowling and Company in 2008. The result of the trial for masks, not statistically significant. McIntyre and Company was another reference here. Their result, not statistically significant. Cowling and Company, published in 2009, quote, not significant. Mask plus hand hygiene protective against lab-confirmed influenza if used within 30 hours. This seems kind of confusing again. This was like hand hygiene without face masks seemed to reduce influenza transmission, but the differences compared to the control group were not significant. That's their quote. So they broke it down further. They was like, maybe over here, there seems to be some benefit, but then they canceled it out. I'll just share a couple more with you really quickly, because again, this is in the community. So this was Aiello. All right. So I hope I'm pronouncing the scientist's name right, but that's the lead researcher and Company. This was published in 2010. And quote, intention to treat. So the intention with this treatment of being face mask, non-significant. Mask plus hand washing, protective in 4 to 6 weeks of observation and beyond. But it wasn't protective for weeks 1 through 3 for some reason. It's just like dumbass stuff like this. It just makes sense. And so here's what they said. Face mask use alone showed a similar reduction in influenza-like illness compared to the control group, but adjusted estimates were not statistically significant. Neither face mask use and hand hygiene nor face mask use alone was associated with significant reduction in the rate of influenza-like illness cumulatively. And I'll share one more. Aiello came back again. This is one of the researchers who's the most versed in studying mask. They published another one in 2012. And this is where, again, it says it appeared to be beneficial in the community. Here's what this was published in PLOS One, by the way. This was a reference put into this bigger study, the International Journal of Nursing Studies. This was published in 2012. Here's what the result of the study was. Quote, we observed a substantial 43% reduction in the incidence of influenza infection in face mask and hand hygiene group compared to the control. That sounds wonderful, but the estimate was not statistically significant. We're looking at probably relative risk reduction, absolute risk reduction. Now, here's the keywords to the study. There were no substantial reductions in influenza-like illness or laboratory confirmed influenza in the face mask only group compared to the control. Again, every one of the references had some version of not statistically significant. And I don't want it to be this way. I'm just looking at the data. And also, The abstract. Why is this so confusing?
We want to trust public health. We want to trust, the medical community. Okay. We don't want to be we're not here just to be difficult, be disagreeable, or just be skeptical. We're skeptical for a reason, because we're trying to get to the truth. Yet they continue to speak very authoritatively on things that they don't have authority on, that do not prove out, that where as you say, they're not conducting random controls trials that prove causation. They are not conducting studies that include a sample size and a data set that are just statistically significant. And this keeps on happening over and over again, which only gives more ground for our suspicions and reduces trust in public health even further.
Perfectly said. And at the end of the day, we could still say, hey, if it helps 1%, why not do it? This is why. So with our kids here in California that are already, they've taken away the use of, they've disallowed cloth masks. I said this back in early 2020. We could have avoided this whole thing. But guess what? My video that I did, which has millions of views on other platforms, it was pulled down off of YouTube within 30 minutes. And all I did was just go through this peer-reviewed evidence and more that I'm not even sharing here right now, just to direct people like, hey, wait a minute. And here's what does have value. We do have some value with N95s.
Sure.
But even that value is mixed. The results are mixed. But here's why. Just saying, hey, just if it even helps 1%. So wearing these respirators, which our children are now here in California, they've shipped millions to schools for children to wear. This study was published in the journal Ergonomics, and the title of the study is Carbon Dioxide Breathing in Respiratory Protective Devices, Influence of Speech and Work Rate in Full Face Mask. And they found that wearing these respirators not only leads to just physiological discomfort, oh, sure, just get over it, leads to fatigue, dizziness, headaches, muscular weakness, and drowsiness. That is our biology telling you that there is something wrong here. Another study, this was published very recently as well. This was looking at, the title of the study is Headaches and N95 Face Mask Amongst Healthcare Workers. This is this kind of smoking gun of this one, and I'll share this with you. This was published by the CDC. The title of the report was The Physiological Burden of Prolonged PPE Use on Healthcare Workers During Long Shifts. And here's what they found in the study. The final report stated that prolonged use of an N95 can potentially cause increased pressure inside the skull, reduced cognition, widespread activation of the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system, and dysfunction of the cardiovascular system, among other things. These are not small things. There is a 100% chance that wearing a mask like this is harming your biology versus the nominal chance. We're talking about a less than 1% risk for poor outcomes to a child. Like, we have to take a proper risk-benefit analysis in this scenario. Is it worth it to potentially harm the physiology of this child, the biology of this child, which again, 100% certain bad things are going to happen. To what degree might be, barely noticeable, but we know that it's causing issues. It's affecting their brain, it's affecting their heart, it's affecting their lungs. And that's not okay. These are our children. And logic has left the room. But instead of them acknowledging, hey, I know we said cloth masks were good and we censored anybody who said otherwise, we fucked up. Cloth masks actually don't wear these. Surgical masks, barely, same thing. The Danish study, the Bangladesh study showed barely a tiny benefit, potentially,
right?
For surgical masks.
Tiny. A benefit, but it's pretty nominal. It's pretty low.
Exactly. And also, again, I'm breaking the study down. So in the Bangladesh study, it was found to be beneficial, just again, 5 to 10% potential benefit for only advanced age groups. So people under 50, there was literally zero benefit.
Wow. And
so again, I'm looking at what the data actually says. And so instead of them acknowledging that this shit doesn't work, they just said wear 2. And instead of acknowledging that they don't work, they said 3 is better. Instead of acknowledging that that doesn't work, they said wear an N95 mask. Put one on your children. Mm-hmm. It is absolute insanity. It is, and it's divided people. It's divided families and communities. But I'm here to say this today, and I haven't said this before. The thing is, that divide was already there. For something like this to fracture our relationships,
yeah,
there was already that potential was there already. This was just something to come and kind of be that final linchpin, or that, not the linchpin, but a final breaking point of something that was already fragile. And we're just going in our day-to-day lives with very superficial relationships. And we don't even really know each other in ways that we did in past generations, because we've outsourced so much of our time and our thinking to, social media and the like. And, so having healthy relationships in the first place, hopefully springs from all of this, where we don't have superficial relationships that people stop talking to people because of a fucking mask. Like, to even say that that's a thing at this point in our evolution is just, it is absolutely ridiculous.
And it is an indicator of a deeper fissures and deeper problems in our society. So I guess the question is, how do we get out of it, right? So, our boy Fauci mentions this week, looks like the pandemic is over and near over for the most part. We've got 2 years of weight gain. We've got 2 years of mostly unhealthy lifestyles, a lot of stress and pressure on people, and to whatever extent, and widespread anxiety disorders, and those have been indulged and amplified by this situation. So, okay, now as we're coming out of it, what's your perspective on what steps we can take and how we can start living more healthy and follow, and like I said, implement and make use of all this great body of knowledge that we are building in the public sphere.
Man, this is the question. I've had to, when all of this started to take place, it was especially troubling for me, because I'm a very optimistic person. I know I've been a little bit irritable, in some of these pieces, but I'm a very solutions oriented person. Mm-hmm. And I've never had to look so deeply at a problem before, at the problem and superficial treatments of things, creating an illusion of wellness, and all these overnight health advocates that are, by all normal standards, incredibly unhealthy themselves, and now holding some kind of authority over people who've invested years of their life to be the best version of themselves.
Right. Unhealthy people lecturing healthy people has been the craziest part about all this.
Everything is disrupted right now. This is the time to act. This is the time to do something. We first do something and change this paradigm where we have a culture of sickness by becoming ridiculously healthy ourselves, by becoming radiantly healthy, becoming more capable, stronger, and more resilient than we've ever been. Because we're going to need to be that to deal with the idiocy that is not going to just lay down and go down without a fight. This isn't over. Even if Fauci's like, well, it looks like COVID's over, whatever, bullshit. They're going to find the next thing to take advantage. They see the door is open. We can literally have our citizens not just take away their rights, but to freely give them away under stress. That card is going to get played again. You better believe it. So we need to build ourselves up and get stronger mentally and physically than we've ever been. It's not even a challenge. I'm not here to challenge everybody. That is my call to arms for everybody listening. Take it upon yourself, stand up right now and get yourself stronger than you've ever been, mentally and physically, so that you can handle this shit. And it's like you're bulletproof, it just bounces right off of you. Any of this idiocy, and you stay focused on the goal, which is truly helping our citizens to get healthier. So that's number one. Focus on getting yourself as healthy as possible. And within that, cultivating healthy relationships. And let this be a lesson to you about the standards that you carry and the people that you've been fucking with who are not about that life and who will turn on you in a second. Like, again, we see these movies where the friend is like the backstab. No, for real. That shit happens in real life. And this doesn't mean that person is a bad person, by the way. It's just like they need healing. They're missing something in their own life, in their own psyche, and their own health. It's very difficult to be compassionate when you don't feel well, by the way. And this is just based on the data. When our blood sugar is dysregulated, there's a study done by researchers at the Ohio State University on married couples, and just seeing dysregulated blood sugar leading to high levels of irritation towards their partner. But here's the biggest thing: less likelihood of them solving their relationship conflicts when their blood sugar is abnormal.
Wow.
I already mentioned earlier in this episode, 130 million Americans have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. That is chronic abnormal blood sugar. People aren't just walking around wanting to be ignorant. It's not to say that when you're not in a good state of health that you can't be compassionate and perspective take and all those wonderful things. It's just harder. It takes biological energy, it's resources to do these things. Again, get yourself healthy as possible, cultivate healthy relationships. And then from there, at this point, literally, none of these asshats deserve your vote if they're not specifically demonstrating what they're going to do to get our citizens healthier and to stop the preying on our citizens by pharmaceutical companies. Like, ask them any chance that you get, what are you going to do about pharmaceutical companies marketing to disabled veterans? Or what are you going to do about these food manufacturers marketing to our children, right? With this processed foods and getting them hooked younger. That's literally, there's a book written on the subject, Get Them While They're Young. That's the kind of the formula in marketing for getting people hooked as early as possible so that they're, quote, lifetime consumer.
Yeah,
right.
No doubt.
So they have to earn your vote, because I know these guys, it's a popularity contest. And even if there are people who get into politics because they want to make a difference, there are. But the nature of it is, in 2020, 2/3 of United States Congress members received a check from pharmaceutical companies. 2/3. It's the nature of the business. It's money. It's a money thing. Even if you're wondering what happened here in California, people trying to run with this whole recall thing, they don't got money like that. These guys are funneling money to this Batman villain, who literally, again and again, he's been caught not doing the thing that he put in as a mandate for us to follow. Because,
Constantly.
and this is the thing, these are the times that he got caught. Let me say that again. These are the times he got caught, even with eyeballs on him. He doesn't give a shit because he's not living by these things, period.
And he's not scared of consequences.
For show. That's it, man. Yeah. Like, so again, really show your power with your vote. Question these people. Stop allowing, like, got to this place where we're trying to always elect the lesser of evils. We got to change this system so we're choosing from the greater of goods. That is a possible outcome, but we have to start to really talk about things that matter. It's so many superficial things. Okay, just to be clear, taxes matter. Yes, I live in California now. I'm not, but
it's a big factor.
But the taxes are a second tier thing to our health, because when you don't have your health, you have nothing. The person who is worried about a tax bill, because they're making higher income, all their one wish is to have good health again. They would trade in. I've worked with these people. They'd give most of their money away just to get their health back. We have to make health a priority, and a priority off the lips of these people, and stop this general bullshit of like, well, you get more healthcare access. Get more healthcare access to shitty healthcare. Yeah. That is sick care. Like, that's not the solution. We've got to provide, we have the capacity to make sure that every citizen of the United States has access to real food. We do. Community wellness programs and neighborhood parks and all of these things that just, these should be the norm at this point. And we can make it happen, but we've got to step up and vote and disrupt the system.
No doubt, and hold these people. And I think what the frustration of fitness professionals such as yourself and nutrition professionals have seen throughout this entire episode was people who do not take responsibility for their own health, unhealthy people making health decisions for everybody else, including people like yourself and other private individuals out there that have been very diligent about about living a healthy lifestyle, and that's got to change. So the last thing before I let you go, if you're just you've found a way to analyze data sets, to analyze studies, you live, you breathe this, and and there are people that can read your materials, listen to your podcast, and engage you. However, if you're just a person out there and you want to take as much responsibility for your own health as possible, and also understand, be able to go and take a skeptical eye to the studies and to the messaging from medical companies, the medical system, and public health, what's your advice to them on how to do some of their own analysis, be their own skeptic, right? Instead of having to rely on people who have really sharpened their sword like yourself.
That's a great question. Great question. The number one thing is you have to get attuned to basic principles and this is why education matters as far as like what the problems are. So you're not just walking into a scenario where you coming in and you've got high blood pressure, maybe your cholesterol is high, and they're like, well, here's lisinopril and here's a statin. We're going to take care of that. If you come into it knowing that they're treating a symptom, my body's giving me feedback with my elevated blood pressure or blood sugar. And what it's doing is a disease is an adaptation by the body, essentially to help you to run and stay alive with this environmental input, an epigenetic influence. So it's helping you to survive under abnormal conditions. So it's actually a disease is like kind of like it's like a warning sign. It's like an alarm going off like, hey, we got an issue over here. But what happens when we just come in and treat it with a drug, we're silencing the alarm. But the problem is still there. And this is why another alarm is going to pop up over here. Your body's going to revolt in another way. You're not going to get well. So it's getting educated on like, how does this system work? Basics about my body, and how do you do that? You can, of course, tune into folks like myself who are, again, just wanting to support and educate based on real world peer reviewed evidence, but also sifting through the evidence. So I'm not just coming with a bias that's just saying, this is the way and the only way,
sure.
But people who actually know, like even all these wonderful diet frameworks that are out there, I'm not going to be a subscriber promoter of any of them. Mm-hmm. You can guarantee that I'm going to promote what's best for you right now and say, hey, these are available tools, right? Because people have gotten results with these things, but many other people haven't. What's best for you? And so, get yourself connected and start to find a funnel of education in a way that's fun, that's connected for you. That's how I got into this field. I found wonderful teachers who inspired me. And, many of these people are my friends now as well, so
I love it.
That's one thing. And the other thing is, if you are looking at, some clinical data as far as like what you should be doing, this particular supplement or drug, whatever the case is, I'm just going to be 1,000 with you. It takes a lot of work and a lot of years to differentiate between what is high quality research and what is garbage, and what also just is inherently going to have a lot of confounding factors and biases and the like. Most peer-reviewed evidence in healthcare is funded by pharmaceutical companies. It's the nature of the beast. And if we even have a randomized placebo-controlled trial for a drug, it's putting the drug up against nothing. A placebo is nothing. Placebos are effective, though, by the way, in many clinical trials, about 30% effective on average in clinical trials. But it's saying, is this something better than nothing? It's not putting the drug up against a lifestyle intervention, for example, which when that was done, funded by the CDC's, this massive diabetes study, they found that, folks who were given metformin did have a reduced risk of developing diabetes, folks who are pre-diabetic. But the folks, and there was also a control group who was just giving general advice. But folks who are giving specific lifestyle intervention and coaching, so talking with them, having repeating coaching sessions, dialing things in, personalized for them, finding out what their challenges are. The results from the metformin performance versus the lifestyle intervention was twice as effective, twice as effective as just taking a drug. All right, so we know it works, but that lifestyle intervention is not going to be promoted by Merck and by Pfizer. You're going to be taking money out of their pockets. So, what I would say is just maintain your sense of sovereignty. Look to your physicians and your healthcare providers as coaches and supporters, teammates. Coaches might even be tough psychologically for you. Instead of this paternalistic relationship, you are the boss of you. You are the CEO of your own body. You have to accept that position first and foremost. The job isn't always going to be easy, but you are definitely going to win in the end.
Love it. Fantastic. That is the empowering and personal agency message that we need coming out of this situation. I know it's been tough on a lot of people, but a lot of the kind of suffocating rules and regulations and messaging that has been coming out of, unfortunately, institutions and authority figures that a lot of people, pre-pandemic, you've been able to take more control over your personal health. It's been a little more difficult over the last couple of years, but it looks like we are hitting a little escape velocity where we may be able to go back to taking care of our own health first and foremost, as opposed to having those decisions made by others. So everyone, Shawn has been such a proponent of personal agency and taking a real clinical and educated approach towards personal fitness and wellness. And I want to thank you so much for that. And Shawn, if you could tell us where to find you on the internet, recent literature that your books that have recently been released and reached the New York Times #1 bestseller, your podcast, please tell everyone where they can find you.
Awesome. So you can find my show. It's called The Model Health Show, The Model Health Show. And, anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll be able to find it. Very grateful to say many times over the years, we've been #1 in the country, #1 health podcast. And I think it's just because we care a lot and we make this education entertaining and fun and empowering. And I'm very big on action steps, but we're targeting specific issues. We do master classes on different subjects.
Yep.
So you walk away with here's 5 clinically proven things that we can do to reduce our insulin resistance right now. So The Model Health Show, and my latest book is called Eat Smarter. And as mentioned, it's a national bestseller, USA Today national bestseller.
Awesome.
And, it was number 17 in the country, both fiction and nonfiction when it came out. So it was on the list with Matthew McConaughey and the Obamas, but there's this guy from Ferguson, Missouri with his book about food. And it just shows me again, people care about this, we're not at that fantasy place that I was at that, again, I thought that we really had this stuff figured out. We are at a place where people care enough to do something. And so very happy about that. So Eat Smarter, anywhere books are sold. We had a national campaign with Target stores as well. So you can pick it up at Target more than likely, unless they're sold out there. And my first book, international bestseller, is Sleep Smarter. So if sleep is a concern, again, very big, there's 21 clinically proven strategies to improve your sleep quality and things that you don't have to turn your life upside down. So so those are gonna be 2 good resources for you.
Love it. Actionable steps, actionable information and knowledge that we're trying to bring to you, everybody. Shawn Stevenson, thank you so much for joining us here today. Prevailing Narrative, I'm Matt Bilinsky. Talk to you soon. I am Matt Bilinsky. Once again, you can listen and subscribe to The Prevailing Narrative on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now. Make sure to follow me on my socials at Matt Bilinsky, MattBilinsky. The Prevailing Narrative is a Cavalry audio production in association with iHeartRadio. Produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Dana Brunetti and Keegan Rosenberger. For Cavalry Audio, I'm Matt Bilinsky.